Gerald Sutton didn't even look at her when he said it. He was standing in the middle of the Red Hollow train platform, one thumb hooked in his vest pocket, the other hand pressing a folded telegram against his chest like it was a deed to something valuable. Vivian Ashcroft had just stepped down from the passenger car, luggage at her feet, dust on her hem, 18 hours of rail travel sitting in her spine, and he looked right through her the way a man looks through a window he has no intention of opening. "I won't be needing you," he said, loud enough for the whole platform to hear. "I'm marrying Margaret Holloway next Friday. Woman's got 300 acres and no debt." He tucked the telegram back into his pocket. "You should have stayed in Charleston." Then he turned and walked away. He didn't even take his hat off. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to our channel right now so you don't miss a single episode of stories like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country you're watching from, because we want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that platform, because what happens next is something Red Hollow never forgot. The train had pulled into Red Hollow at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 1879, and the September air in Wyoming had that particular quality it gets toward the end of summer, warm in the sun, with a cold edge underneath that reminded you. Winter was already packing its bags somewhere north of the Bighorns. Vivian Ashcroft had been watching the landscape change for the last 4 hours through a window that hadn't been properly cleaned since sometime in the previous decade. She had pressed her fingertip against the glass once, just to test it, and pulled away a gray smear that she wiped on the underside of her seat where no one would see. She was not a woman who complained about small discomforts. She had learned in 24 years of living that small discomforts were the ones you could manage. It was the large, sudden ones that knocked you sideways. She had one trunk and one valise. The trunk held everything she owned that was worth keeping: 3 dresses, 2 practical, and 1 for occasions, her mother's sewing kit, a set of bone-handled hairbrushes, 6 months of Gerald Sutton's letters tied in a bundle with kitchen twine, and a small framed photograph of herself at 19 that she'd included in her first letter to him because his advertisement had specifically requested one. The valise held what she needed for the first few days: a change of clothes, her toiletries, the small leather purse containing $41 and some cents, which was what remained after purchasing her train ticket from Charleston. She had sold her furniture. She had given up her room at Mrs. Delaney's boarding house, where she had lived for 2 years after her mother died, and left behind nothing but the hairbrushes and a small debt to the apothecary. She had said goodbye to the 3 women she worked alongside at the dressmaker's shop on Calhoun Street: Clara, who cried; Mabel, who said nothing but pressed both her hands hard; and Josephine, who was practical and told her to keep some money separate from her main purse in case of emergencies. Vivian had thought that was wise advice. She had not thought she'd be needing it quite this soon. When the train slowed and the platform came into view, she had felt something she wasn't quite willing to call nervousness. More like a heightened awareness, the kind that sharpens everything slightly. She had smoothed her skirt. She had straightened her hat. She had picked up her valise and waited near the door while the train ground to its final stop. And when she stepped down onto the platform boards, she had been, for a moment, almost exactly what she'd hoped to be: composed, presentable, arriving. Then she saw Gerald Sutton's face. She knew it from the photograph he'd sent: a formal studio portrait, the kind men sat for when they wanted to look respectable. He was 43, he'd written, a cattle rancher with good land and solid prospects, a widower of 4 years who wanted a capable woman to share the work of building something lasting. He had written well. His letters were not poetic, but they were direct and they were specific, and Vivian had appreciated that. He'd described the ranch, the land, the town. He'd described himself without excessive flattery or false modesty. He had asked her, in his 3rd letter, whether she was the kind of woman who was frightened by hard work, and she had written back that she had never had the luxury of being frightened by it. He had written back, "Good. Neither have I." She had read that letter 4 times. Standing on the platform now, she registered several things in rapid succession. He was watching her come toward him. He was not smiling. His expression was not the expression of a man who was nervous about meeting a woman he'd corresponded with for 7 months. That expression she would have understood, would have even found endearing. This was something else. This was the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting to deliver it. She was still 5 steps away when he spoke. I won't be needing you. The words landed flat and hard, the way a rock lands when you drop it from height. Not thrown, dropped, deliberate. I beg your pardon? She said it quietly. She was not sure she had heard correctly. She needed him to say it again so she could be certain she was not misunderstanding something. He said it again. The part about Margaret Holloway, the 300 acres, the Friday wedding, the telegram against his chest. And then the part that hit harder than any of it. You should have stayed in Charleston. And then he walked away. For a moment, 3, maybe 4 seconds, Vivian stood completely still. The valise was in her right hand. The platform boards were uneven under her feet. Somewhere behind her, a child was asking his mother something about the locomotive, and the mother was shushing him. She was aware that people were looking at her. She could feel it the way you feel heat from a stove. Not touching her yet, but present, radiating. She did not cry. She wanted to be clear about that. Even just to herself, she did not cry. What she did was set her valise down on the platform very carefully, as though it contained something fragile. She straightened her spine, already straight, but she straightened it further. She looked at the direction Gerald Sutton had gone, which was toward the far end of the platform where a buckboard and a gray horse were waiting, and she watched him climb up onto the seat without looking back. She breathed once, slowly, through her nose. Then she looked around the platform. There were perhaps 20 people in her immediate vicinity. Some had stopped moving. A woman near the station door had her hand at her throat. 2 men by the freight cart had their heads together, talking low. A boy of about 12 was staring at her with the open, unself-conscious curiosity that only children are capable of, and beside him an older man had his hat in his hands and was looking at the ground, which she somehow found more difficult to bear than the staring. She heard someone nearby say, not bothering to keep it quiet, "That's the mail-order bride he sent for." And someone else, a woman's voice, lower but still audible. What's she going to do now? That was the question. Vivian Ashcroft was standing on a train platform in a town she had never been to, with $41 and some cents, a trunk of belongings, and nowhere to go. The train would not make a return run to the east until Thursday morning. She had 2 nights to figure out something. She picked up her valise. She was going to need to find the hotel and see what a room cost, and then she was going to need to sit down somewhere quiet and think clearly, and she was going to need to do both of those things without letting the people on this platform see anything on her face beyond composed dignity, because the moment she showed them anything else, the whispers would change character entirely, and she did not have the energy to manage that right now. She had taken 3 steps toward what she assumed was the main street when she heard boots on the platform boards behind her, moving at a different pace than the general movement around her. Deliberate, unhurried, but direct. She did not turn around immediately. She waited until she heard them stop, close, and to her left. "Ma'am." She turned. He was tall, not in the exaggerated way of men who want you to notice their height, but in the straightforward way of someone who simply was. Lean, weathered in the face the way men get when they spend most of their lives outdoors, with dark eyes that were looking at her directly without the prying quality that most people's stares had carried in the last few minutes. He was wearing a work coat that had seen considerable use and a hat that had seen more. He had his hands at his sides, not in his pockets, not on his belt. "Rowan Calloway," he said. "I run the Calloway Ranch, about 4 miles northeast." He didn't extend his hand, which she noted, not rudeness, she thought, but a reading of the situation. He wasn't sure what she needed right now. "I want you to know that what just happened was not decent, and I'm sorry you were treated that way." Vivian looked at him for a moment. "Did you know him well?" she asked. Sutton. "Well enough." Something moved in his expression, not quite contempt, more like long familiarity with a specific kind of disappointment. "Well enough to not be surprised, which I am sorry for also." She looked away, back toward the street. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. That's kind. There's a widow, Mrs. Fenwick, runs the boarding house on the east end of Crane Street. She's fair with her rates, and she doesn't ask unnecessary questions." He pulled a folded bill from his coat pocket. "If it's a matter of—" "No." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Thank you. Truly. But no." He put the money back without comment. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. "All right," he said. Then, after a brief pause, "The Grand Western Hotel on Main charges $1.50 a night, and the sheets have fleas. Mrs. Fenwick charges 75 cents and they don't. Despite everything, despite the platform and the 20 watching people and the $41 and Gerald Sutton's retreating back. Vivian felt the corner of her mouth move, almost involuntarily, in something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "That's useful information," she said. "I thought it might be." She picked up her valise again and nodded once, the way you nod when a conversation has reached its natural end, and she started toward the street. She had gotten perhaps 10 feet when she heard him behind her again, not following, just speaking from where he stood. "Miss Ashcroft." She stopped but didn't turn all the way around. "Yes?" "If you find yourself needing work of an honest kind, I'm short a person to run my household accounts and the ranch books. The position pays $8 a month, room and board included." A pause. "No strings of any kind. The offer stands for as long as you're in Red Hollow, however long that turns out to be." Now she did turn. He was still standing where he'd been, hands at his sides, watching her with the same direct quality she'd noticed before, not pressing, just stating. "Why would you offer that?" she asked. He considered this. She had the sense that he was actually thinking about it, not assembling a polite answer, but actually thinking. "Because you're going to need something to do for the next 2 days until the train goes east," he said finally. "And because 3 months of honest work would give you enough to get back to Charleston, or somewhere else, with more than you've got right now. And because—" He stopped. "Because?" "Because Gerald Sutton made a public fool of himself today, and nobody said a word to him about it, and that bothers me." She studied him. He looked back at her without flinching, and without whatever quality it is that men get when they're trying to seem trustworthy. That overeager straightforwardness that is actually a kind of performance. He just looked back at her. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I asked," he said. "What?" Mrs. Fenwick's boarding house was exactly as described. 75 cents a night, no unnecessary questions, sheets that did not bite. The room was small and faced west, and when Vivian sat on the edge of the bed and untied her hat and set it on the dresser, the late afternoon light came through the curtains in long horizontal lines that moved slowly as she sat there. She had been sitting for perhaps 10 minutes when she let herself feel, briefly and carefully, what she had been holding at arm's length since the platform. It wasn't grief exactly, or not yet. It was something more like a sudden weightlessness, the feeling of having all the structure of a plan removed from beneath you and finding yourself suspended in mid-air with nothing to push against. She had spent 7 months building toward a specific future. She had been methodical about it. She had read each letter carefully and thought about what they revealed. She had asked questions, practical ones, about the work involved in the conditions and what he expected of a partner. She had assembled a reasonable picture of a reasonable life, and she had moved toward it as deliberately as she knew how. And the man she'd built it around had looked through her like a window. She sat with that for about 4 more minutes. Then she got up, unpacked what she needed from the valise, washed her face in the basin, and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Fenwick about the nearest place to get a decent meal. Mrs. Fenwick was a compact woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned up severely and the kind of practical efficiency that comes from running a small business alone for a long time. She set a plate of cold chicken and bread on the kitchen table without being asked and sat down across from it with her own cup of coffee. "I heard about the platform," she said. "I assumed you had," Vivian said. "Gerald Sutton is not a well-liked man in this town." Mrs. Fenwick said this without particular heat, as though it were a weather report. "He is, however, a man with money and land and no remaining concern for what people think of him, which in this territory amounts to the same thing as power." She looked at Vivian steadily. "Are you all right?" "I will be," Vivian said. It was not a deflection. It was accurate. "What will you do?" "I'm deciding." Vivian pulled a piece of bread apart. "I met a man named Calloway on the platform." Something shifted in Mrs. Fenwick's expression. Not alarm, more like a recalibration. "Rowan Calloway. You know him." "Everyone in this valley knows Rowan Calloway." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He's been ranching the northeast quarter of this valley for 11 years. Lost his wife to fever 7 years back. Runs a clean operation, pays his men on time, doesn't overgraze, doesn't cheat on weights." She paused. "He's not a man who says things he doesn't mean." "He offered me work," Vivian said. "Household management and accounts. 3 months, $8 a month, room and board. Mrs. Fenwick nodded slowly, as though this fit with something she already knew. And you're wondering. I'm wondering. What are you wondering exactly? Vivian looked at her plate. Whether it's a reasonable proposition, or whether I'm so off balance right now that I can't tell the difference between a lifeline and a bad decision. Mrs. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. Then, if Rowan Calloway offers you a job and says no strings, there are no strings. That's just his character. She paused. Whether it's a reasonable proposition depends on what you need, which only you can answer. I need 3 months of earning time, Vivian said, to figure out what comes next. Then it sounds like a reasonable proposition. She went back to Calloway Ranch with him the following morning. He came to Mrs. Fenwick's at 7, which she appreciated. Not 6, which would have felt presumptuous, and not 8, which would have felt uncertain. 7 was the time of someone who was organized. He had a wagon rather than a buckboard, and the horse pulling it was a dark bay with a white star on her forehead. The morning was cold enough that her breath was visible. He helped Vivian load her trunk onto the wagon without commentary and climbed up to the seat beside her and picked up the reins, and they drove northeast out of Red Hollow without either of them saying anything for the first 10 minutes. She spent the silence looking at the land, which was big in the specific way of Wyoming. Not just wide, but somehow vertical, even in the flatness of the valley floor, as though the sky were pushing down and the earth were pushing back. She had lived her whole life in Charleston, where the horizon was almost always interrupted by buildings or trees or the marsh haze. Out here you could see for distances that made her feel slightly unmoored, as though she might need to reach out and hold on to something to keep her bearings. You can ask whatever you need to know, he said, finally, without preamble. She glanced at him. About the position? About anything that would help you feel less uncertain about where you're going. He kept his eyes on the road. I'd rather you have accurate information than spend the morning worrying about something I could have just told you. She considered this for a moment. How many people are on the ranch? Full-time? 7. 3 ranch hands, Tom Briggs, who's been with me 9 years. Pete Danner, 6 years. Cal Whitmore, 3. A cook, Delia, who's been there longer than any of us and runs the kitchen like it's her personal territory, which it is. A stable hand named Jesse, who's 16 and not always reliable in the mornings. And Hector, who oversees the cattle operation day to day and is the most competent man I've ever employed. He paused. And now you. What happened to the person who ran the accounts before? A brief pause. My wife did. After she asked, I handled it myself, which is not my strongest ability. A year ago, I hired a young man fresh from school in Cheyenne who turned out to have better arithmetic than judgment, and I let him go after he made 3 errors in the supply ledger and 1 significant error involving cash. What kind of error involving cash? Another pause, shorter. He helped himself to $20 from the reserve fund and thought I wouldn't notice. Did you fire him or press charges? Fired him. He was 19 and it was his first job, and I thought the lesson was sufficient. He glanced at her sideways. If you're asking whether I'll be watching you for the same thing, the answer is no. I make my judgments about people once, and then I hold to them. And your judgment about me is based on approximately 12 minutes of conversation on a train platform, Vivian said, not quite as a challenge, more as a statement of the obvious. My judgment about you is based on watching how you stood after Gerald Sutton walked away, he said. That told me what I needed to know. She didn't answer that. She looked back at the road. What exactly does the household management position involve? She asked. The accounts are the main thing. The ranch ledger, supply ordering, payroll calculations, correspondence with buyers and suppliers. Delia runs the kitchen and doesn't need managing. She'd be insulted by the suggestion. The ranch house needs attention. It's been functioning rather than maintained for several years, and it shows. Beyond that, it's whatever presents itself. $8 a month, she said. $8. First month paid at the end of the first week, so you know the money is real and not theoretical. She turned to look at him directly. Why the first week? Because you're walking into an unfamiliar situation on somebody's word, which requires a measure of trust from you, and the least I can do is demonstrate early that the word is good. He said this matter-of-factly, without any air of generosity, the way you state a practical principle. Vivian looked back at the road. All right, she said. All right? I'm saying all right to the terms. She straightened slightly on the seat. I'll have the ledger reviewed by the end of the first day, and I'll give you an accounting of what I find." He glanced at her. "That fast?" "I worked accounts at a dressmaker's shop for 2 years. It's not complicated work, it's just careful work." She paused. "Is the ledger badly kept?" "It's honestly kept," he said carefully. "It's just not well organized. I can fix that." "I expect you can," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not condescension and not flattery either, more like a quiet, straightforward confidence in her, based on nothing more than the evidence of the morning. She found that she didn't mind it. The Callaway Ranch announced itself first as a smell: wood smoke, horse, the deep mineral scent of the grassland, and then as a gate, timber with the name worked into it in iron letters that were starting to rust slightly at the joints, and then as a long, low approach road with the main house at the end of it and the outbuildings arranged in a practical arc to its left. The house was bigger than she'd expected, 2 stories, weatherboard, with a porch running the full front length. It had been, at some point, well kept. The bones of it were sound, good materials, solid construction, but the porch needed painting and one of the shutters on the upper left window was hanging slightly crooked, and the front garden had reverted over several seasons to something between cultivation and wilderness. She looked at it for a moment without saying anything. "I know," he said, reading whatever was on her face. "It's been functional." "I wasn't going to say that," she said. "I was going to say the structure is good. Whoever built it knew what they were doing." He looked at her briefly, as though checking whether she was being polite or genuine. "My wife chose the design," he said. "She had opinions about how a house should be built." She had good ones. They pulled up to the front, and before he had climbed down from the seat, the door of the house opened and a woman appeared on the porch. Delia, Vivian assumed, who was in her 50s with forearms that suggested she had been stirring things and lifting things for decades, wearing a work apron and an expression that was the very specific combination of curiosity, suspicion, and reserved judgment that domestic authority figures deploy when someone new is being introduced into their territory. "Morning," she said to Rowan. Then she looked at Vivian with a neutral and thorough attention. "Delia," Rowan said, "this is Vivian Ashcroft. She's going to be managing the accounts in the house." Delia was quiet for a moment. "The whole house?" "The accounts and the non-kitchen portions," Vivian said, before Rowan could answer. "I understand the kitchen is yours." Delia looked at her steadily. "That's right." "Then we won't have any disagreement about that," Vivian said pleasantly. Something moved in Delia's expression, very briefly, that might, in better light, have been the beginning of approval. "Breakfast was at 6, she said. "If you're late, there's bread on the counter." "That's fine," Vivian said. "I don't need to be waited for." Delia looked at Rowan once, a look that communicated something, though Vivian couldn't read its precise content, and then went back inside. Rowan helped her down from the wagon seat, which was unnecessary but she didn't object to it, and carried her trunk to the front door. "Your room is the second door on the left upstairs," he said. "The lock on it works. There's a key on the dresser." She noticed that he had said this without being asked. She noticed also that he let her carry her valise herself. Inside, the house confirmed what the exterior had suggested: sound bones, years of maintenance that had been reduced to necessity. The furniture was good quality and worn to comfort. The floors were clean but unpolished. The walls had pictures that she thought had probably been arranged by his wife and not touched since: a landscape, a small oil painting of what looked like a coastal scene somewhere far from Wyoming, a framed photograph of a couple in formal clothing whom she guessed were his parents. The account ledger was on the desk in the small room off the front hallway that served as an office. He showed her to it without preamble and left her to it, which she also appreciated. She sat down at the desk and opened the ledger. He had been right, honestly kept, poorly organized. The numbers were accurate. She could tell within a few minutes that whoever had been maintaining it had not been fabricating, but they were entered in whatever order they'd been thought of rather than any systematic structure. Supply costs mixed in with payroll, mixed in with the records of cattle sales. No monthly summaries, no forward projections. She flipped to the most recent entries and noted the last date: 6 weeks prior. 6 weeks of transactions were unrecorded. She found a blank sheet of paper in the desk drawer and began making notes. 3 hours later, when Rowan appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee, she had organized the last 2 years of records into a summary and identified 4 categories of expenditure that were costing more than they needed to because no one had been tracking supplier pricing comparisons. She told him this. He leaned against the doorframe and listened, both hands around his own cup. How much more? Roughly $40 a year on dry goods alone, if you switch suppliers or negotiate better terms with your current ones. She turned the summary toward him. You're also being charged storage fees at the Hartley warehouse that you wouldn't need to pay if you adjusted your ordering schedule by about 2 weeks forward. That's another $18 annually. He looked at the summary for a moment, then at her. You did that in 3 hours. It's not complicated, she said again. It's just careful. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I said the first month's pay would come at the end of the first week. Yes. I'm adjusting that to the end of today. She looked at him. He was still looking at the summary, not at her. That's not necessary, she said. No, he agreed. It's not necessary. I'm doing it anyway. He set the coffee cup on the edge of the desk, in reach of her but not placed with any intention beyond practicality, and pushed off the doorframe. Delia does lunch at noon, she'll call. He left. Vivian looked at the coffee cup for a moment, then at the ledger, then out the small window of the office that looked north across the grassland. The sky was very blue. The grass moved in a wind she couldn't hear from inside. She pulled the ledger back toward her and kept working. Also, by the end of the first week, she had reorganized the accounts entirely, identified 12 separate areas of potential savings, drafted 2 letters to suppliers requesting pricing reviews, and created a forward schedule for the next 6 months of supply orders that would eliminate the storage fees. She had also repaired the broken shutter herself, using a toolbox she found in the barn and instructions from Jessie the stable hand, who was 16 and not always reliable in the mornings, but turned out to know a great deal about basic carpentry. Where'd you learn to use a screwdriver? Jessie asked, watching her work from the porch railing. My mother's boarding house needed constant maintenance and she couldn't afford to hire it done, she said, making the adjustment and testing the hinge. Your mother ran a boarding house? She ran one until she got sick, and then I ran it until she died, and then the owner sold the building. She checked the shutter's swing. It was level now. Hand me the smaller screwdriver. Jessie handed it over without further question, but she could feel him looking at her with the recalibrated curiosity of someone who has discovered that a person is not what they initially assumed. By the end of the first week, also, she had been introduced formally to the 7 permanent members of the ranch in various ways. Tom Briggs was reserved but courteous. Pete Danner was cheerful and asked unnecessary questions, which she answered without irritation because the questions were well-intentioned. Cal Whitmore was shy and spoke mostly to his boots. Hector was 52, Mexican-born, had been running cattle operations for 30 years, and looked at her with the thoughtful assessment of someone who was determining whether she was going to make his life better or more complicated. She understood the assessment and didn't take offense at it. At the end of her 4th day, Delia put a plate of apple cake on the office desk without any comment and went back to the kitchen. Vivian ate it while reviewing the payroll records and understood that this was the closest Delia was going to come, for the time being, to a statement of acceptance. The one person she interacted with least in the ordinary course of the days was Rowan himself. This was not avoidance on either side. It was simply the structure of how a working ranch operated. He was out from before dawn until the late afternoon, and the work she was doing was primarily indoor and desk-based. They spoke in the evenings, usually on the porch after dinner, and the conversations were practical. She would report what she'd done, he would answer questions, and occasionally, more frequently as the days passed, the conversation would extend beyond the practical into other territory. On the 5th evening, he told her about the cattle breeding program he was developing, a crossbreeding approach he'd been reading about in agricultural journals that he believed could significantly improve herd quality over 5 to 8 years. He described it with a technical specificity that made it clear he'd been thinking about it for a long time and hadn't had many occasions to talk through it with someone who would engage seriously rather than politely. She asked questions because the questions occurred to her, and because the logic of the program was interesting, and because she noticed that when she asked a good question, his whole manner changed slightly, becoming more animated in a way he seemed to be only partially aware of. On the 7th evening, she asked him about his wife. She did this carefully, because she was aware it was territory that required care, but also directly, because she thought he would prefer directness to the kind of delicate avoidance that would have made it strange. He was quiet for a moment, looking out across the dark yard where the grass moved in the night wind. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was 29 when she died. She was from Pennsylvania, came out here for the same reasons people come, or used to come. She believed in the possibility of the place." He paused. "She was smarter than I am, better with people. She's the one who made the ranch hands feel like they were part of something instead of just employees, and I've been, imperfectly, trying to maintain that since." Another pause. "She would have liked you." Vivian looked at the dark yard. "I think I would have liked her." They sat with that for a moment, the comfortable silence of people who have been in each other's company long enough to not require constant filling of quiet space. "Why didn't you marry again?" she asked. 7 years is a long time." He looked at her. There was something in the look, not offense, but a recognition of the question's weight. "I almost did," he said, 3 years after Clara. A woman named Helen, whose husband had died. We had a reasonable understanding for about 4 months. He looked back at the yard. Then she moved to Denver to be near her sister, and I realized that what I'd felt wasn't what it should have been, for either of us, probably. "That's honest," she said. "I try to be." "You succeed at it more than most people." He looked at her sideways, in the way she'd come to recognize as his manner of checking whether a statement was simple observation or something more complex. "You sound like you've known people who didn't." "I've known plenty," she said. "Gerald Sutton, for one." His expression shifted. "He said more, I think, than what the platform saw. In those letters." She was quiet for a moment. "He said enough in the letters to make me believe it was worth crossing half the country for." She kept her voice even. "He was specific and he was practical and he never said anything that seemed untrue." She paused. "I think the truth is just that he meant it all when he wrote it, and then Margaret Holloway appeared with her 300 acres, and he revised his priorities. It wasn't about me, exactly." "That doesn't make it better." "No," she agreed. "But it makes it explicable." He looked at her again with that direct quality she'd stopped finding unsettling and had started finding she was aware of this and was being careful about it, something closer to steadying. "You're not angry," he said. Not quite a question. "I was angry," she said, "for about 4 minutes on the platform. Then I set it down because I couldn't afford the weight of it." She looked out at the yard. "I'll pick it up again sometime when I have space for it." He was quiet. Then, "That's practical," she finished, with the not-quite smile she seemed to produce involuntarily in his presence. With an increasing frequency she was trying not to examine too closely. "I was going to say admirable," he said, "but practical also works." The night wind moved through the grass. The lamp behind them through the window put a yellow rectangle of light on the porch boards. Somewhere in the dark, one of the horses moved in the stable, a soft sound that carried easily in the quiet. "I should go in," she said. "I want to finish the supplier letters in the morning before breakfast." "All right," he said. She stood, and he stood when she did. The automatic courtesy of a man raised to it, but done without self-consciousness. She went to the door and had her hand on it when she turned back. "Mr. Calloway." "Rowan," he said, for the first time, quietly, without pressing it. She considered this for a moment. "Rowan." It felt different, saying it, more accurate, somehow, to whatever the actual situation was. "What you did on that platform, stepping forward like that. You didn't know me." "No," he said. "Why did you do it?" He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, the way he stood when he was thinking through something he wanted to say accurately rather than quickly. "Because there are things you do," he said finally, "not because you know the person, but because the moment is the kind that defines what kind of man you are. And I'd rather know the answer to that question before I have to." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went inside. She lay awake for a while, listening to the Wyoming night, the wind, the grass, the occasional movement from the stable, and thinking about how 3 months had seemed on the platform like a way station, a brief necessary interruption between where she had been and wherever she was going. She was not sure, lying in the dark in the second room on the left, that she had correctly anticipated what 3 months in this place was going to feel like. She was not sure of several things, actually. She pushed all of them aside with the same practical firmness she'd applied to everything else since the platform, turned onto her side, and went to sleep. But the thing about practical firmness is that it works better in daylight than in the dark. And what she didn't know, couldn't have known yet that first week, was that Red Hollow had not finished with her. Gerald Sutton's rejection had not gone unnoticed by everyone in the valley, and not everyone had drawn from it the same conclusions. There were those who pitied her, there were those who admired how she'd carried herself, and there were those, fewer but present, as there always are, who had decided, without much evidence, that a beautiful young woman who had come west for a man and ended up on a different man's ranch must be a particular kind of woman. That particular kind of judgment was coming. She would find this out on a Thursday morning, 11 days after she arrived, when she rode into Red Hollow to meet with the dry goods supplier and ran into Margaret Holloway outside the mercantile. Margaret Holloway was 45, solid, with a face that had more authority than warmth, and the manner of a woman who had managed her own affairs successfully for long enough that she'd stopped differentiating between efficient and unkind. She looked at Vivian with a thorough assessment that took perhaps 2 seconds and concluded itself before Vivian had fully stopped walking. "Miss Ashcroft," she said. Not a greeting, a notification of recognition. "Mrs. Holloway," Vivian said pleasantly, "I hear you've landed yourself at the Callaway Ranch." "I'm employed there, yes." Something moved in Margaret Holloway's expression, a carefully constructed, not quite smile that had ambiguity built into it, the kind designed to communicate something to anyone watching without leaving the speaker directly responsible for having said it. "Well," she said, "Rowan Callaway is a generous man." Vivian looked at her steadily. "He is," she said. "He also keeps excellent records and pays on time, which is what I primarily care about in an employer." A brief silence. Margaret Holloway recalibrated something. "Of course," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," Vivian said, and went into the mercantile. Inside, she stood for a moment in front of the hardware display, bolts and nails and hinge sets arranged on a board, and breathed carefully. The conversation had been, on the surface, entirely polite. It had also been a very specific kind of assault, delivered with the precision of someone who had done it before and knew how to make it land without fingerprints. She understood what was being said. She understood what the valley was whispering. What she felt, standing in front of the hardware display, was not primarily humiliation, though that was there. It was something more specific, the frustration of being defined entirely by a situation someone else had created, of being the mail-order bride and then the woman on Callaway's ranch, with no room in that story for who she actually was. She bought the supplies she'd come for and drove back to the ranch. She told Rowan about it that evening. She told it plainly, without drama, and watched his face during the telling. "What she said wasn't false, technically," Vivian said. "That's the elegant part." "No," he said. His voice had gone to a very quiet place. "She knows what she was saying." "She does." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that I don't intend to let it change anything I'm doing here. If there are people in this town who've decided what story I'm in, that's their decision, not mine." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to justify your position here. I know that. I'm just telling you what to expect in case it affects the ranch." He looked out at the yard. His jaw had tightened slightly. "It won't," he said. "And anyone who brings that kind of noise onto my property is going to find out pretty quickly that I have limited patience for it." "I'd rather you didn't," she said. "I'd rather it be handled by what happens here, by what people see, than by confrontation." He looked at her. "You think you can change what they're saying by doing the work," she said. "Yes. I think that's the only way to change it permanently. Confrontation changes it for a day." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Your call." "It is," she agreed, "though I appreciate that you wanted to." He looked slightly away. "Don't make a thing of it," he said. She didn't, but she noted it. 3 weeks in, she had become, in the ordinary daily life of the Callaway Ranch, less like someone passing through and more like someone who was where they were supposed to be. The ledger was current and organized. The supplier costs were coming down. Delia had progressed to occasionally asking her opinion on supply quantities, which was the equivalent, coming from Delia, of a declaration of deep personal regard. Hector had stopped looking at her with that quiet assessment and started looking at her the way he looked at things that were working properly, with a settled, comfortable attention. Jesse had taught her to identify 3 different types of grass by feel and was working on a 4th. Tom Briggs had said, unprompted, one afternoon, that she'd found the error in the East Fence materials order that had been making the numbers come out wrong for 2 seasons, and said it in a way that was clearly meant as a compliment, even though it came out sounding like a report. She realized on a Tuesday afternoon while reorganizing the upstairs linen closet, not miserable. She was, in fact, carefully, tentatively, in the way of someone who has learned to hold good things gently rather than grip them, something closer to the opposite. She was also, if she was being honest with herself in the way she tried to be, beginning to notice things about Rowan Calloway that had nothing to do with whether he was a reliable employer. She noticed that he had a specific way of listening, fully present, not waiting for his turn to speak, actually processing what was being said to him, that she had encountered in perhaps 5 people in her life. She noticed that when something went wrong on the ranch, a calf lost, a fence section down, a supplier who shorted an order, he dealt with the problem first and showed the frustration later and briefly, like a controlled burn. She noticed that he remembered things she had mentioned once in passing and referred back to them later in ways that made it clear he had actually been listening. She noticed that in the evenings, sitting on the porch, the stretch of time before she said I should go in was getting longer. She knew what this was. She was not naive about it. She was also aware that she had arrived in Red Hollow under the worst possible set of circumstances for trusting her own judgment about men. She had thought Gerald Sutton's letters told her something true about him. She had been wrong. The rational response to that was not to immediately apply new trust to the next man she encountered, however different he appeared. She told herself this on the Tuesday afternoon with the linen closet. She told herself it was sensible and accurate. She was right, of course. She was also aware, sitting with the fresh stacked linens and the autumn light coming through the upstairs window, that being right about something and being governed by it were 2 different propositions entirely, and that the 3 months were only half over, and that she was no longer entirely sure what happened at the end of them. The linen closet conversation she'd had with herself on that Tuesday afternoon turned out to be the kind of private resolution that reality has no particular obligation to respect. What happened on Wednesday made that clear. She had ridden into Red Hollow again, alone this time, to drop off the revised supplier letters at the post office and collect a package of account ledger books she'd ordered through the mercantile. It was early enough that the main street was still in the process of waking up. The bakery open, the post office just unlocking its door, the saloon still shuttered. She tied the horse at the post office rail and went inside and conducted her business with the postmaster, a quiet man named Albright, who handled transactions with the focused economy of someone who believed conversation was an inefficient use of official time. She came back out and was untying the horse when she heard Gerald Sutton's voice. He was across the street, in front of the land office, talking to 2 other men she didn't recognize. He hadn't noticed her yet. He was doing the talking and they were doing the listening, and the quality of the listening, slightly deferential, slightly cautious, told her something about how Sutton operated in this town. He was a man people were careful around, not because they liked him, because it was prudent. She had the horse untied and was preparing to mount when he turned and saw her. The silence that crossed the street between them lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he said something to the men beside him, low, and both of them looked at her, and one of them said something back that made Sutton smile. It was not a pleasant smile. She mounted the horse, turned it, and rode back toward the ranch without hurrying. She did not look back across the street. She kept her hands steady on the reins and her spine straight and her expression arranged in the neutral way she had been arranging it since the platform. But her hands, once she was past the edge of town and the street noise fell away, were slightly less steady than she would have preferred. She had told Rowan she didn't want confrontation. She had told herself the work would answer the whispers. She believed both of those things. She still believed them. She also believed, riding north through the grassland with the morning wind coming off the hills, that Gerald Sutton was not a man who would simply become an object of quiet embarrassment and leave it at that. Men like that, men who projected authority and had money and no remaining concern for others' opinions, didn't absorb quiet judgment without eventually responding to it. He had already lost something on that platform, not just the practical advantage he'd sought by rejecting her, but the public dignity of the whole transaction, because Rowan Calloway's 5 words had reframed the story. She leaves this town with me. That was what people remembered, not Sutton's rejection, Rowan's response to it. That was the kind of thing a man like Sutton did not forget. She did not tell Rowan about seeing him on the street. There was nothing to report. Nothing had happened, technically, and she didn't want to produce concern where none was yet warranted. She filed it in the same practical place she filed most things that needed watching but not yet acting on, and went back to the accounts. 2 days later, Hector came in from the southern pasture and found her in the office and stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands, which was how Hector communicated that something required attention, but he wasn't sure how to begin. "What is it?" she asked, without looking up from the ledger. "Might be nothing," he said. "Tell me the nothing and I'll agree with you or not." He turned his hat once. "Pete rode the fence line on the southwest quarter this morning. 3 sections are down. The wire's not broken from weather or age, it's cut." She set her pen down and looked at him. "Cut. Clean. Both sides of each post." He looked at the hat. "That's cattle grazing land on the other side of that fence. We've got 30 head of breeding stock in that pasture." She was quiet for a moment. "Where's Rowan?" "North quarter with Tom. I sent Cal to ride back for him." "How long since Pete found the fence?" "About an hour." She stood up. "Has anyone moved the cattle?" "Pete's holding them back from the gap, but he's one man." She went to the door. "Get Jesse to help Pete. I'll have Rowan back in 20 minutes. She stopped. "Actually, can you fix the fence yourself with what we have in the barn?" "Given time." "Then start on one section. When Rowan and Tom get back, they can help with the others." She looked at him directly. "Do you know whose cattle are on the other side?" Hector's expression was controlled, but she could read the thing underneath it. "The grazing land on the southwest border belongs to the Sutton Range." She absorbed this without reaction. "All right," she said. "Start on the fence." She got the horse and rode north. She found Rowan and Tom at the far fence line, which was also the one that needed attention, a section of posts that had heaved in the last freeze and needed resetting. They both looked up when she came at the pace she was riding, and Rowan's expression shifted before she had fully stopped. "Southwest fence," she said when she reached them. 3 sections down. Wire's been cut." Tom said something under his breath. Rowan was already moving toward his horse. "Sutton's cattle?" he asked. Hector didn't say so directly. He didn't need to. They rode back together, the 3 of them, at a pace that ate the distance quickly. She told him, on the way, about seeing Sutton on the street 2 days prior. She told it plainly, as she told most things, without editorializing. He listened without interrupting. "You should have told me," he said when she finished. "Nothing had happened." Still nothing," she said. "There was nothing to act on." He was quiet for the remainder of the ride, which was a particular kind of quiet she was beginning to recognize. Not anger at her, but something working itself through, something being assessed and weighed. When they reached the southwest pasture and she saw his face as he looked at the cut fence and the 30 head of breeding stock milling on the wrong side of it, she understood that the thing being weighed was old and had more history behind it than just this morning. "He's done something like this before," she said. It wasn't a question. Rowan crouched down by the nearest cut section. The wire ends were clean, as Hector had said. Professional, almost. 4 years ago, he said. Water rights dispute. 3 of my water sources came up compromised in the same month. Nothing I could prove directly. He looked at the wire. Sutton doesn't do things himself. He has people. Can you prove this? Same as last time, probably not. Then what do you do? He stood up, and when he looked at her, his jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was working hard at being measured. Fix the fence, he said. Move the cattle. Document everything. And then? Wait for him to make a mistake I can prove. She looked at him steadily. How long have you been waiting? He met her eyes. 4 years. She turned and looked at the cut wire, the milling cattle, the grassland beyond. Then she turned back. I want to see your property deed records, she said, and any documentation you have of the water rights dispute. All of it. He looked at her. Why? Because if he's been doing this for 4 years and nothing's been provable, that either means he's very careful or there's documentation somewhere that nobody's organized properly. She held his gaze. I'm good at organization. He studied her for a moment. That direct quality, assessing. Then he nodded once. Tonight, he said. Tonight, she agreed. They spent the rest of the afternoon fixing the fence. She worked alongside Hector and Jesse on the second section, while Rowan and Tom handled the first, and Pete moved the cattle back to proper position. The work was harder than anything she'd done in Charleston. The wire resisted, the post needed 2 people and sometimes 3, and by the time the sun started dropping, she had a cut on her left palm from the wire and dirt in places she would need to wash out carefully. Jesse looked at her hand at one point and said, "You want to stop?" "No," she said. He handed her a rag from his pocket. It was not clean. She wrapped it around her hand and kept working. Delia met her at the back door when she came in and looked at the wrapped hand and the general condition of her and said nothing, which, coming from Delia, was the equivalent of a long speech about frontier practicality. She put water on and produced a proper bandage from the kitchen cupboard and cleaned the cut with an efficiency that suggested she had done this many times. "Bad?" Delia asked. "Not deep," Vivian said. "Hurts, though." "Yes." Delia tied off the bandage and stepped back. "He let you help with the fence." "He didn't have grounds to stop me." A look crossed Delia's face. Complicated. Several things at once. "No," she said. "I suppose he didn't." She turned back to the stove. Dinner in 20 minutes. At dinner, the table was quieter than usual. The fence repair sat over the meal like a presence. Pete was tired and showed it. Tom ate with a focused efficiency that meant he was still working through something in his head. Hector said almost nothing. Rowan ate, asked 2 practical questions about the next day's schedule, and otherwise was internal in the way she'd come to understand meant he was managing something below the surface carefully. Afterward, she helped Delia clear, which she did most evenings, and which Delia no longer protested, and then went to the office, where Rowan had already laid out 3 boxes of papers on the desk. "That's everything," he said. He was standing by the window, coat still on from outside. "The deed records going back to when I bought the land. The water rights documentation. The correspondence during the dispute 4 years ago. What there is of it." He paused. "I'll tell you now. It's not organized." "I'll manage," she said. She sat down at the desk and opened the nearest box. He pulled the chair from the corner and sat down across from her, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected him to leave her to it. "I can explain what I remember of the sequence," he said. "Might be faster than trying to reconstruct it from the papers alone." She looked up. "All right." He told her the history while she worked through the boxes, pulling relevant documents and sorting them into categories as he spoke. The water rights dispute had begun in the summer of 1875, 4 years prior. 2 of his 3 water sources had suddenly shown contamination, chemical, not natural, and the third had been partially diverted by an earthwork that had appeared on the southwest property line overnight. He'd filed a complaint with the county. The county had sent a surveyor who found the earthwork but couldn't determine when it had been built or by whom. Sutton had denied any knowledge. The contamination had cleared on its own within 6 weeks, which a county official had noted as evidence it was likely naturally occurring, though Rowan believed otherwise. "There was a man named Warren," he said, deputy county clerk at the time. "He handled the complaint filing. I always thought he filed it wrong on purpose, put the wrong survey coordinates on the formal record, which meant the earthwork was technically documented as being on my property line rather than on his." "Is Warren still the deputy clerk?" "He moved to Cheyenne 2 years ago." Rowan paused. "Promoted." Vivian looked at the paper she was holding, the original complaint, with the survey coordinates notated in the margin. She looked at them carefully. "These coordinates are wrong," she said. "I know. That's what I just... No, I mean, I'm looking at your deed record right here, and the actual property line is clearly documented. The survey coordinates in this complaint are off by almost 200 yards. She turned the deed document toward him and placed the complaint beside it. "If someone challenged this formally, with a proper surveyor, not a county-paid one, the error would be obvious." He leaned forward and looked at both documents. For a moment, he was very still. "I didn't look at them side by side," he said. "At the time, there was a lot happening, and I was trying to manage the water shortage and the complaint simultaneously." "The error might have been deliberate," she said, "or it might have been genuine carelessness by a clerk who was being sloppy. Either way, it creates a documented discrepancy that a lawyer could work with." She looked at him. "Do you have a lawyer?" "I've used a man in Cheyenne named Alderman. I haven't spoken to him in 2 years. You should write to him. Tomorrow. She paused. And you should have someone document tonight's fence damage in writing. Dates, description, a sketch of each cut section. All three of us who saw it, separate statements. Rowan was looking at her the way he sometimes looked at her. That focused, full attention quality, but with something additional in it tonight that she couldn't precisely name. You're not just organizing accounts, he said. No, she agreed. I'm figuring out how someone has been taking advantage of the fact that this ranch's documentation has never been put in order. She looked back at the papers. He's been able to get away with things partly because you couldn't counter them with clear records. That's fixable. Vivian, the way he said her name, not the formal Miss Ashcroft, not the careful distance of an employer, stopped her. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression that was, she thought, a man trying to be careful about something. Why are you doing this? She looked at him for a moment. It was a fair question. She thought about answering it practically. Because it's part of managing the ranch properly. Because organized records prevent problems. Because it's the right thing to do. All of those were true. Because I am tired, she said instead, of watching people who operate on the assumption that others aren't paying close enough attention. Sutton cut that fence because he assumes nothing organized is going to come from this direction. He's been assuming that for 4 years. She paused. I'd like to adjust that assumption. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back slightly, and something in his expression shifted. Something relaxed, minutely, that had been held taut. All right, he said quietly. They worked for another 2 hours. She organized. He answered questions and, increasingly, asked them about her system, about which documents she was flagging and why, about the legal logic she was applying, which was not legal training exactly, but the practical logic of someone who had managed accounts and correspondence for years and understood how documentation functioned as evidence. At one point, around 9 o'clock, Delia appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and set them on the desk corner and retreated without a word. Rowan and Vivian both looked at the cups, then at each other, and something passed between them that was almost amusement but settled into something quieter. She doesn't normally do that, he said. I know, Vivian said. She's decided something about you. I think she decided it right around the time I ate the apple cake without asking where it came from, Vivian said. He looked at her. She put cake in the office? Day 4. He was quiet for a moment. Delia has never put cake in the office, he said, with a mild wonder that she found, despite herself, charming. She went back to the papers. Don't make a thing of it, she said, using his own phrase back at him. He didn't, but she could feel him looking at the papers with something that was not entirely focused on the papers, and she chose not to acknowledge it. They finished around 10, and she organized the relevant documents into a separate folder for the letter to aldermen in Cheyenne. And they each wrote out their statements about the fence in separate documents, and she drafted a formal description of the damage with the date and time and the names of all witnesses. When it was done, she sat back in the chair and stretched her neck, which had tightened from 2 hours of leaning over the desk. And he stood and stretched also. And for a moment they were both just 2 people in an office at 10 o'clock at night who were tired and had accomplished something. That was useful, he said. More useful than 4 years of waiting. You didn't have the right tools 4 years ago, she said. You do now, or you will, when Alderman writes back. He nodded slowly. Then, your hand. She looked at the bandaged cut. It's fine. Delia look at it? Yes. Then it's fine, he said, accepting this as verification. She stood and gathered her lamp. At the door she paused, because she had something to say, and she thought it was better said than not. Rowan, what happened today? What Sutton did. I know it's not about me. The fence and the history with the water rights. That's all about this land and this ranch and what you've built here. She looked at him. But I also know that what happened on the platform 4 weeks ago, the way things got reframed because of what you did, that irritated him. And I want you to know that I'm aware that my being here may have contributed to whatever decision he made about that fence. Rowan looked at her steadily. Sutton would have found a reason, he said. He's been looking for one for years. You're not the cause of this. I may have accelerated the timing. Maybe. He held her gaze. I don't have a problem with that. She studied him. You should think about whether that's true. I already have, he said, Tonight, while we were fixing the fence. He paused. The answer is the same. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded and went upstairs. She lay in the dark for a while and thought about what had been said and not said, and about Sutton, and about the cut fence wire, and about the way Rowan had sat in the office, not because he needed to be there, but because he wanted to be there. She thought about all of these things with reasonable analytical distance, which was something she was good at. She also thought about how he said her name when he was being direct, and about the fact that being good at analytical distance did not, in practice, make a person immune to the things that made distance difficult. She thought about the 3 months, and about the question of what came after them, which she had been trying not to examine too directly. Then she stopped thinking about it because it was late and the cut on her hand was throbbing slightly, and she had a ledger to update in the morning. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, paradoxically, both easier and more complicated. Easier because she knew the ranch now. Its patterns and needs, its small peculiarities, the way the supply schedule needed adjusting every 6 weeks to account for the mercantile's irregular delivery times. The fact that the East Pasture Gate had a latch that only Hector knew the trick of. The specific way Delia's mood in the morning predicted the quality of the next 12 hours in the kitchen. She knew where things were and what they required, and she moved through the work with the efficiency that comes from actual familiarity rather than careful attention. More complicated because knowledge, it turned out, was not the same as distance. Knowing a place meant you were no longer outside it looking in. And knowing the people in it, really knowing them, the way you know people when you share a table and a porch and a working day, made the careful analytical stance she'd been maintaining increasingly difficult to sustain with full integrity. Jessie had taken to sitting on the fence rail when she came out to ride in the mornings, offering unrequested information about the horse's current temperaments, with the enthusiasm of someone who had found an audience. He had also, at some point, started teaching her to read the weather, not from instruments, but from the quality of the light and the behavior of the grass, things he'd learned from Hector, who had learned them somewhere in a life that preceded Wyoming. She listened and remembered, because the information was genuinely useful, and because Jessie's pride in teaching something was evident and touching in the way that very young people's pride usually is before life teaches them to conceal it. Hector, as the weeks passed, had begun occasionally stopping at the office door in the evenings to ask her opinion on operational questions, not because the questions required account management, but because, she suspected, he had determined that she had good judgment and it was efficient to use it. The questions were things like whether it made sense to consolidate the south and east herd management into a single rotation, or whether the breeding program Rowan was developing should be documented in a separate ledger from the general operations. She answered honestly, including when the honest answer was that she didn't know enough about cattle operations to have a valid opinion. Hector responded well to that. "Most people fake the opinion anyway," he said once. "What's the point of that?" she asked. "Saves face," he said. "At the cost of being wrong," she said. "Yes," he said, as though she had confirmed something he had always believed. Tom Briggs had reached some threshold she couldn't precisely identify. On a Thursday afternoon, about 5 weeks in, he stopped by the office to say that the supply delivery from Cheyenne had come in 3 days early, and she noticed that he said this to her directly, rather than going to find Rowan first. It was a small thing. It was also not small. Pete Danner remained cheerful and inquisitive. Cal Whitmore remained shy and communicative primarily through his boots. With Delia, things had reached a functional warmth that neither of them discussed or acknowledged, which was exactly right for both of them. The kitchen remained Delia's territory absolutely, and Vivian respected this with a completeness that Delia apparently found sufficient basis for trust. They had begun, in the mornings, to share the first hour of the day in a companionable parallel. Delia at the stove, Vivian at the kitchen table with her coffee and the day's account notes, without needing to narrate the arrangement. Once, Delia said, "Gerald Sutton's first wife died young too." Vivian looked up from her notes. "I didn't know he'd been married." 18 years ago. She was from a decent family in Colorado." A pause, Delia stirring something. Nobody was surprised. Vivian held that for a moment. "What do you mean?" Delia set the spoon down and turned to look at her directly, something Delia did rarely and only when she meant to be heard precisely. "I mean, nobody was surprised she died young. Not the way people usually mean that." She picked the spoon back up. "I'm not saying anything I could prove." Vivian looked down at her account notes. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. Outside, Jesse was talking to one of the horses in his morning way. "Thank you," Vivian said quietly. Delia said nothing. But the kitchen stayed companionable. The letter from Alderman in Cheyenne arrived 3 weeks after they sent it. Rowan brought it to the office in the afternoon, and they read it together, standing at the desk side by side, in a posture that had become, without either of them deciding it, their ordinary arrangement for shared information. Close enough to see the same document, shoulders almost but not quite touching. Alderman's assessment was measured and careful, the way lawyers write when they're being honest about mixed prospects. The documented coordinate discrepancy in the original complaint was, he wrote, a legitimate legal anomaly that created grounds for a formal challenge to the water rights filing. Whether it was actionable depended on additional documentation and would require a proper survey by an independent party. The fence damage, documented as they had documented it, was more difficult. Without a witness to the cutting itself, circumstantial evidence was unlikely to rise to the level required for a civil action. However, he noted, it contributed to a pattern that, if the water rights challenge was pursued and successful, could form the basis for a broader claim of deliberate interference. "He's saying we have something," Vivian said, when they both finished reading. "He's saying maybe," Rowan said. "That's more than you had 4 years ago." He folded the letter. There was something in his expression, not relief exactly, more like the careful management of something that wanted to be relief but had been disappointed before and was protecting itself. "The survey will cost money," he said, "and if Sutton gets wind of it before we're ready, he'll have time to—" "I know," she said. "We move quietly. I can write to Alderman to recommend a surveyor who doesn't operate locally, someone Sutton won't have a connection to. And we don't change anything visible on the ranch that would signal to him that something's changed." Rowan looked at her sideways. "We." She stopped. The word had come out naturally, without her noticing. She looked at the folded letter in his hands. She started. "Don't," he said. Not unkindly, just stopping her from backtracking. He set the letter on the desk and looked at the window. "Don't qualify it. It's accurate." She was quiet. The window showed the front yard, the gate, the road north. The late afternoon light made everything look amber and permanent. "It's accurate for now," she said, carefully. He turned and looked at her. She looked back. It was the kind of moment that has a specific weight, when two people in a room are both fully aware of exactly what is being said and not said, and the space between those two things is charged with something that neither of them is ready to close yet. "Yes," he said. "For now." He picked up the letter and moved toward the door. "I'll write to Alderman tonight." "I'll draft it," she said. "You tell me what you want said." He paused at the door. "All right." He left. She sat down at the desk and looked at the blank paper in front of her and was very still for a moment. Then she picked up the pen and began to draft the letter. The autumn deepened into October with the particular efficiency of Wyoming weather, which does not ease into its seasons but simply arrives in them. The days shortened fast. The mornings had real cold in them now, not the light cold of September, but the substantive kind that reminded you it was building toward something. She had been at the ranch for 6 weeks. The accounting was the best it had been in years. Rowan had said this in his direct way, without embellishment. The savings from the supplier renegotiations were materializing. The first month's reduced costs had come in $12 under previous levels, which wasn't dramatic but was consistent. She had created a forward budget for the winter months that Hector had reviewed and made 2 corrections to, both of which she incorporated without friction. She was, by any practical measure, doing the job well. She was also, by any honest measure, no longer operating from the detached efficiency of someone with a 3-month arrangement and a future elsewhere. She knew this, and she had not resolved it. She had set it to the side the way you set a question to the side when you don't have enough information to answer it. Not ignored, just deferred, pending further evidence. The evidence kept arriving, though, in small forms, persistently. On a cold morning in the second week of October, she had come downstairs before dawn. She'd been waking earlier as the days shortened, an adjustment she didn't fully understand, and found the kitchen empty and the stove unlit. She'd started the stove herself, for the warmth and for the coffee. She was standing at the window with her cup when she heard boots on the porch. Rowan came in from the dark, bringing the cold with him, stopped when he saw the lit stove and the cup in her hand, and said nothing for a moment. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Same," he said. He took off his coat and hat and hung them on the peg by the door, and came to the stove and poured himself a cup from the pot she'd already made, and then he stood on the other side of the kitchen from her, both of them with their cups, the pre-dawn quiet around them. "Bad dream?" she asked. "Not a dream," he said. "Just things that pull at you when it's dark." "What kind of things?" He looked at her. In the lamplight his face was open in the way it rarely was in the daylight hours. Less guarded, or guarded differently, the way people are at 5 in the morning when the usual social architecture hasn't assembled itself yet. "The water rights case," he said. "Whether it's the right move or whether it provokes him into something worse." A pause. "The breeding program, and whether the financing will hold through 2 hard winters if they come back to back." Another pause. "Whether I've been running this place in the right direction or just in the direction I know." She listened. He was not asking for answers, she understood that. He was saying what was in his head because 5 in the morning and 2 people in a lit stove was the kind of moment when things came out. "And?" she said, because there was an and. He looked at his cup. "And whether 3 months is an amount of time that means anything at all, or whether it's just a number somebody said." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the first gray beginning of the morning was just starting to distinguish itself from the dark. She did not answer him directly. She thought about whether to and decided against it, because they were both in the particular vulnerability of the early morning, and she didn't want to say something that was true at 5 o'clock and complicated at noon. She also thought it was a question that was better answered over time than in words. "The water rights case is the right move," she said. "The breeding program financing will hold if you adjust the winter feed contract the way I suggested last week. And the direction you know is the right direction because I can see the results of it in every person on this ranch." She looked at him. "Those are the answerable ones." He looked at her. Something in his expression moved. "And the 4th one?" he said. "I'm still working on that," she said. He nodded slowly, as though this were a reasonable answer, which, she thought, it probably was. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and put his coat back on. "I'm going to check the south fence before Hector gets up," he said, "since I'm already awake." "Be careful in the dark," she said. "Always am," he said. He went out. She stood at the window with her cup and watched the gray morning come in across the yard, and thought about what she'd said and what she hadn't, and about the third question she'd answered last. The direction you know is the right direction. And about the fact that she'd meant it not as comfort, but as observation, which was different and more serious. She also thought about the fact that she was now, 6 weeks in, considerably more uncertain about what happened at the end of 3 months than she had been at the beginning. Then Delia came downstairs, took one look at the lit stove and the made coffee, and said, "You started the fire." "You were asleep," Vivian said. "I'm never asleep at this hour," Delia said, with the affronted dignity of a woman whose routine has been disrupted by someone being helpful. "You were this morning," Vivian said pleasantly. Delia poured herself a cup of the coffee and drank it without further comment. This was, Vivian had learned, Delia's version of concession. The morning moved forward. The ranch came awake in its usual sequence. The work resumed. And somewhere south of the ranch, on the other side of the repaired fence line, Gerald Sutton was sitting at his own breakfast table, reading a letter from his man in town, the one who kept an eye on things, that told him something he found very interesting, that Vivian Ashcroft had been seen leaving the Red Hollow post office with a package of correspondence that, if his man's information was accurate, had been sent by a lawyer in Cheyenne. He set the letter down and drank his coffee slowly. Then he told the man sitting across from him, a wide-shouldered individual who was not, technically, employed by the ranch, that he might need his particular skills in the coming weeks. The man nodded and asked what kind of skills. Sutton said the kind that don't leave clean evidence. Outside the Callaway Ranch, the October morning was brilliant and cold and deceptively peaceful, and Vivian was at her desk reviewing the winter feed contract adjustments, and Rowan was in the south pasture checking fences he'd checked the night before because he couldn't sleep, and neither of them knew yet what was already moving toward them from the south. The first sign came on a Wednesday, and it wasn't the fence this time. Pete Danner found it at first light, 3 of the breeding herd's best cattle, the ones Rowan had been developing his crossbreeding program around, standing at the far east water trough, with a stillness that was wrong. Not sleeping standing, which horses do, and cattle sometimes do. Wrong standing. Two were on their feet, but unsteady, moving their heads in the slow, effortful way of animals that are trying to function through something interfering with the effort. The third was down. Pete came to the house at a run, which was not how Pete Danner moved under ordinary circumstances. Vivian heard the boots on the porch before Rowan did. She was already at the desk by 6:30, the winter feed contract revisions laid out, and she was at the front door when Pete reached it. "Something's wrong with the east herd," Pete said. His face was doing the particular thing faces do when the speaker is trying to be calm, and the information is not calm. "Three head. Aldridge, the big roan, he's down." She went to the stairs. "Rowan," she called up, clear and loud, not panicked. He was down in 2 minutes, coat half buttoned, and they went to the east pasture together with Pete and Hector, who had heard the commotion from the bunkhouse. Aldridge was still down when they got there. The other two were marginally better, or at least more upright, but their eyes were dull in the specific way that meant internal trouble. Rowan crouched beside Aldridge and put his hands on the animal's neck and flank, and stayed there for a moment with his eyes closed in the way of someone making a physical assessment through touch. "Water," he said. Hector was already at the trough, crouching low, looking at the surface and then cupping a small amount in his palm and bringing it to his nose. He stayed that way for a full 3 seconds. "Something in it," he said. He set the water back without drinking it. "Not strong, but wrong." Vivian looked at the trough. An iron tank, about 6 feet long, fed by a pipe from the eastern water source. She looked at the pipe. She looked at the ground around the pipe inlet, which was soft from recent moisture and showed, very clearly in the early morning light, boot prints that were not from anyone on this ranch. She had learned in the past 6 weeks the boot prints of every person who worked here. "Someone was at the pipe," she said. Rowan stood and looked where she was looking, his jaw set. "How long ago?" he asked Hector. Hector looked at the prints, reading them the way he read the grass for weather. "Night. Late. The ground was drier when they came. The print edges are crisp. After midnight." "Can Aldridge be moved?" Vivian asked. "Carefully," Rowan said, "and slowly." He looked at Pete. "Get the other two away from this trough and onto the north water source. Check the north source first before you let them drink." He looked at Hector. "Get Doc Marsh from Red Hollow." "Doc Marsh is a people doctor," Hector said. "I know. He's also the only one in 20 miles who knows anything about treating poisoning and can tell us what's in that water." Rowan looked at the trough. "Bring a sample bottle from the kitchen." Vivian was already turning back toward the house. She got the bottle, and she got a second one, and she returned to the trough and filled both samples herself because she wanted to be careful about the seal and the label. She wrote the date, time, and source location on each label in her careful hand. "2 samples," she said when she gave them to Hector. "In case one breaks." Hector looked at the bottles, then at her. He didn't say anything, but he tucked both bottles into his coat with a care that communicated that he understood the logic and agreed with it. He wrote out. The morning that followed was one of the hardest Vivian had experienced since arriving in Wyoming, and not because she was frightened exactly, but because there was very little she could do that was useful, and she was not good at that condition. She helped where she could. She held the gate while Tom and Cal maneuvered Aldridge slowly across the pasture to the barn. She brought water to the 2 standing cattle from a clean source and watched them drink with the cautious attention of someone who is monitoring for change. She made coffee and brought it to the people who were working and made sure it was available without insisting anyone take it, because there are times when you push help on people and times when you simply make it available. Rowan was in the barn with Aldridge when she brought his cup. She set it on the rail, and he didn't look up from where he was crouched beside the roan, so just said, "Thank you," in the voice of a man who is concentrating on something else entirely. She stood at the barn entrance for a moment. Aldridge was breathing, labored, but breathing. "Is he the best of the breeding stock?" she asked. "He's the center of the program," Rowan said. "Everything else I've been developing is built around his bloodline." A pause. "If he dies, the program doesn't end, but it goes back 3 years." She absorbed this. "Then he won't die," she said. Not as a promise. She had no authority to make that promise. more as a statement of intention. Rowan glanced up at her then, briefly. He didn't answer, but something in the glance acknowledged what she meant. She went back to the house. Doc Marsh arrived by mid-morning, a rangy man in his 60s who had come to Wyoming as a young physician and stayed because, he told whoever asked, the territory kept him from being bored. He examined the water sample with a concentrated attention that suggested he had seen this kind of thing before, and then he went to the barn and examined Aldridge and the 2 other affected cattle, and then he came to the kitchen table and told Rowan and Vivian what he'd found. White hellebore extract, he said, or something near enough to it. It's plant-based, which is why the concentration is relatively low. Whoever put it in there either didn't know the proper dose or didn't want to kill outright. Wanted to sicken. He folded his hands on the table. The roan is the worst because he drinks more than the others. He'll be down for 3 to 4 days. He'll likely recover if you keep him off the bad water and get fluids into him regularly. Likely, Rowan said. I won't say certainly. He's stressed and he's not young. Doc Marsh looked at him steadily. But he's strong, and the dose wasn't high enough to be definitive. I'd say 70-30 in his favor. Rowan was quiet. White hellebore, Vivian said. Is it something you'd find on this property? Grows wild along stream banks, Doc Marsh said. But extracting it in a concentrated form requires preparation. Someone who knows what they're doing. He paused. Or someone who was told what to do. Vivian looked at Rowan. He was looking at the table. I need you to write that down, she said to Doc Marsh. Everything you just told us. The substance, the probable concentration, the method of introduction, your assessment of the source. Dated and signed. Doc Marsh looked at her. For legal purposes. For documentation purposes, she said. Whether legal purposes follow is a separate question. He nodded slowly and accepted the paper she provided and wrote his account with the careful precision of a man who understood, without being told, that precision mattered here. He signed it. Vivian dated the corner and signed her name as a witness and placed it with the water sample labels in the folder she had started for the property dispute documentation. The folder was getting full. After Doc Marsh left, she and Rowan sat at the kitchen table alone. Delia was out delivering supplies to Cal in the south, and the house was quiet. The silence between them was the kind that happens after a morning that has cost something. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, just waited. He's escalating, Vivian said. Yes. The fence could have been a warning, or a test of how we'd respond. She looked at her hands on the table. This is not a warning. This goes after the breeding program specifically, which means he knows what the breeding program means to the ranch's future value. She paused. Someone told him. Rowan looked up from the table. What do you mean? The breeding program isn't public knowledge. You've written about it in the agricultural journals you subscribe to, and you've discussed it with Hector and the hands, but it's not something you'd advertise broadly. She kept her voice even. For Sutton to know that Aldridge specifically is the center of it, that's specific knowledge. Rowan was still. Are you saying someone on this ranch? I don't know, she said. I'm saying that specific information went somewhere it shouldn't have, and we need to know where. She looked at him. Who knew the details of the program? He thought. Hector, Tom. The Agricultural Journal. I wrote an article 2 years ago, but it didn't name the specific animals. He paused. And a man named Driscoll, who was here last spring looking at purchasing breeding stock. I showed him the program details because he seemed like a genuine buyer. Did he buy? He didn't. He said the price was more than he'd planned for and he'd write. A pause. He never wrote. Describe him, she said. He described Driscoll, mid-40s, wide, dark-haired, not from Wyoming. Vivian listened carefully. Wide-shouldered? She said. Yes. She said, does that match the man Sutton's been seen with in town? The one who isn't employed by the ranch, but who Hector mentioned a few weeks back? Rowan went very still. Hector mentioned him? In passing, the day after the fence. He said he'd seen Sutton in front of the land office with a man he didn't recognize, wide, not local. She paused. I didn't think it was relevant at the time. I think it might be now. Rowan stood up from the table and went to the window. His back was to her, and she could see the tension in it. Not explosion tension, but the tension of a man holding something tightly that very much wants to be let out. Rowan, she said. I know, he said. Getting angry at Driscoll right now doesn't help Aldridge. A long pause. I know that too. Write down everything you remember about Driscoll. What he looked like, what name he gave, where he said he was from. All of it. I'll add it to the folder. He was quiet for another moment. Then he turned from the window and sat back down, and she gave him paper and he wrote. Aldridge held on through the first night and improved slightly through the second day, which Doc Marsh, called back to check on him, said was a favorable sign. The 2 other affected cattle recovered faster and were showing normal behavior by the end of the week. The breeding program had not been destroyed, but it had been made precarious, and the uncertainty of those first 72 hours had cost Rowan something she could see in him, but that he didn't articulate. He came to the barn before dawn each day that week to check on Aldridge himself. She knew this because she was awake for 2 of those mornings and heard him go, and because Jesse, who slept in the stable loft and had appointed himself unofficial night watch after the poisoning, told her. He sat with him for 2 hours last night, Jesse said on the 3rd morning. Just sat there. Vivian was at the fence rail where she'd been helping Jesse with the morning feed. She didn't look up from the feed bucket. That's his business, she said. I know, Jesse said. I'm just saying. A pause. He doesn't do that. Not normally. He checks on things and then he goes back to what needs doing. He doesn't sit. She looked up at the stable. The door was closed. Inside, she knew from her morning check, Aldridge was standing, actually standing, on his own, for the first time since the poisoning. He'll be all right, she said, meaning Aldridge. Yeah, Jesse said, meaning something slightly different. He picked up the next feed bucket. She says you're different from the other one. The other one? The woman who was here 2 years ago, the one Rowan was going to marry. He said it without the caution an adult would have applied, just as information, the way teenagers report things. Helen, Delia says you're different. Vivian was quiet for a moment. In what way? Jesse shrugged. She said Helen was nice, but she was going to leave. She said she could see it before Helen knew it herself. He looked at the feed bucket. She didn't say what you were going to do. Did you ask her? She said some things you've got to figure out for yourself. Vivian absorbed this. Delia, in the kitchen, through Jesse, on the fence rail at 7 in the morning. The woman's methods were oblique but remarkably effective. Finish the south section first, she told Jesse. Then come find me. I want to check the north water source before Hector gets back. She spent the rest of that morning methodically testing each of the ranch's 5 water sources, taking small samples and labeling them and checking for the smell and visual qualities that Doc Marsh had described as early indicators. All 5 were clean. She still labeled the samples and kept them, because she had learned in the past weeks that documentation gathered before a problem was infinitely more valuable than documentation gathered after. She was at the north source, the last of the 5, crouched at the pipe inlet with her sample bottle, when she heard a horse behind her. She stood and turned. The man on the horse was not from the ranch. He was wide-shouldered, mid-40s, dark-haired, sitting on a gray horse on the far side of the north fence, with an ease that suggested he had been there a while before she noticed him. He was looking at her with an assessment in it that was not comfortable. Miss, he said. She stood straight. The sample bottle was in her hand. This is private property, she said. That fence is the property line. Just passing through, he said. His voice was flat, without particular regional accent, the accent of a man who had spent time in many places and absorbed none of them. You're not passing through, she said. You stopped. A slight smile. Not a good smile. Nice morning for stopping. The road to Red Hollow is 3 miles west, she said. If you're looking for passage through the territory, that's the public road. He looked at her for another few seconds with that assessment she disliked, and then he looked at the sample bottle in her hand, and then back at her face, and his expression changed very slightly, acknowledging, she thought, that she had understood something, and he knew she had understood it. Careful out here alone, he said. Country's not always safe for a woman on her own. He turned the horse and rode south without hurrying. She watched him go until he was small against the grassland, and then she finished sealing the sample bottle and walked back to the ranch at a pace that was not a run but was faster than normal. She found Hector in the equipment barn. Wide man, she said, mid-40s, dark-haired, gray horse, heading south from the north water source. She described the encounter in the same plain, organized way she described everything. Is that the man you saw with Sutton? Hector was quiet for a moment. Close enough, he said carefully. He came to look at something, she said. Either he was checking the effect of the poisoning, or he was checking whether we'd responded in a way that worried him. She paused. He saw the sample bottle. So he knows we're documenting. Yes. She looked at Hector. Where's Rowan? South Quarter. Send someone for him, please. Not urgently. I don't want the man to see a lot of movement if he's still watching, but soon. Hector sent Cal. Rowan was back in 20 minutes. She told him exactly what had happened, sitting in the office, the sample bottle on the desk between them. When she finished, Rowan was quiet for a long time, long enough that she let it go without filling it. He's watching to see if we'll act, he said finally. Yes. And now he knows we're collecting evidence. She looked at the bottle. Which means if he was considering escalating further, this tells him the window is closing. Which might make him more dangerous. Or it might make him more cautious. Depends on how much patience he has. She paused. I think he doesn't have a great deal. He's been escalating quickly. Fence, then water, then the direct observation. That's not the pattern of a patient man. Rowan leaned back in the chair across from the desk. What do you want to do? The question landed with a particular quality. Not what should we do or what do you think? What do you want to do? She held it for a moment. I want to write to Alderman again, she said. Tell him about the poisoning and the man at the fence. Today. She paused. I also want you to talk to Tom and Pete and Cal separately. Not about Driscoll, just generally about whether anyone's been approached by anyone asking about the ranch's operations. Without suggesting you suspect anyone, just a general conversation. You think it might have been deliberate. I think Driscoll could have been very good at asking questions that seemed innocuous. She kept her voice even. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm ruling things out. He nodded. Tonight? As soon as you can do it naturally, she said. Not all three in a row. That'll look like an inquiry. I know how to talk to my men, he said, without edge, just as a fact. I know you do, she said. I'm sorry. He looked at her. Don't apologize for being thorough, he said. It doesn't suit you. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the pen and started the letter to Alderman. 2 days later, the letter was sent. Rowan had his conversations with Tom, Pete, and Cal separately over the course of 3 evenings, folded into ordinary talk about the ranch, and reported back to Vivian that nothing he'd heard suggested deliberate disclosure. Cal, in particular, had mentioned that Driscoll had asked very specific questions during his spring visit about which animals were being bred and why, and had seemed particularly interested in the roan, had asked to spend time with Aldridge specifically, which Cal had allowed because he'd assumed the man was a genuine buyer. Not Cal's fault, Vivian said when Rowan told her. No, Rowan said. He wasn't looking for it. None of us would have been. She looked at the window. Outside, October was doing what October does in Wyoming, stripping the last warmth from the days and making promises about what November intended. Sutton sent a man who looked like a buyer and got what he needed. He's been patient when it suited him. You said he was impatient. He's impatient about outcomes, she said. He can be patient about method when he needs to be. She paused. That's the more dangerous combination. The letter from Alderman came faster this time, a week rather than 3. The poisoning documentation, combined with the earlier coordinate discrepancy evidence, had moved him from measured to cautious urgency. He wrote that he was recommending they retain an independent surveyor from Denver, a man named Park, who was recognized by the territorial court and had no connections in the Red Hollow Valley. He was also recommending they file a formal incident report with the county sheriff regarding the water contamination, even knowing that the connection to Sutton would be difficult to prove. The filing mattered not for its immediate utility, but for the record it created. File with the sheriff, she said, when they'd both read it. Rowan looked at the letter. Dunmore's the sheriff here. He and Sutton are friendly, I know. Hector mentioned it. She looked at him. File anyway. The record is what matters. If Dunmore buries it, that becomes its own part of the pattern. She paused. Do you have a contact at the territorial level? Anyone above Dunmore? I know a man in Cheyenne named Garrett who handles land disputes for the territory, Rowan said slowly. I've met him twice. I don't know him well. Write to him, she said. Copy him on everything we're sending Alderman. Not as an accusation, Just as a courtesy notification to the territorial level that you filed locally and wanted the territory to be aware. She looked at him. It creates another set of eyes. Sutton can't pressure everyone. Rowan looked at her across the desk with that expression she had come to recognize. The one that was assessment, and something else that she was getting less willing to pretend was only assessment. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked. "Running a boarding house when I was 21, while my mother was dying and the building owner was trying to find grounds to evict us before she did," she said. "You learn quickly how documentation works when you're the one who doesn't have money or influence." He was very quiet. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know that. It was a long time ago." She looked at the letter. "The point is, I know how people with power operate when they assume you can't fight back. They leave gaps because they don't think anyone capable of using them is paying attention." She looked at him. "We're paying attention." "We are," he said. The word settled between them the same way it had the first time, accurate and more than accurate. Sheriff Dunmore received their report on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon Rowan had heard, through Tom who had heard through Pete, who had a friend who worked at the livery, that Dunmore had mentioned the report to at least 2 people in Red Hollow, including the owner of the saloon and the woman who ran the post office, which meant it would reach Gerald Sutton by Friday morning. When Rowan told her this, they were on the porch. The evening was cold enough now that she could see her breath. "Good," she said. He looked at her. "Good? If Sutton knows we filed with the county and copied the territorial office, he knows we're not operating quietly anymore." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "We weren't going to catch him by being secret. We're going to catch him by being organized and persistent and visible enough that he can't move without creating a record." She paused. "Unless he panics." "And if he panics?" She looked out at the dark yard. The grass moved in the cold wind. "Then it gets harder before it gets resolved," she said. She said it evenly, because that was the truth and she was not someone who softened truths. But she was also aware, sitting there in the cold, that she had said we throughout the entire conversation, "We're paying attention, we weren't going to catch him, we're going to catch him," and that Rowan hadn't noted it or corrected it or qualified it, and that this absence of qualification was itself a statement. The 3 months were 8 days from ending. She had not raised this. He had not raised it. The silence around this subject was not avoidance exactly, more like a mutual acknowledgement that it was a conversation that needed to happen, that both of them knew it needed to happen, and that there was a tacit agreement to let the current crisis work itself out first. Then Sutton removed that option. It was a Saturday evening, the last day of October, and Vivian was alone in the house when the trouble came. Rowan and Hector were in the north pasture, a fence section down again, not cut this time but genuinely weathered, and they were working to have it repaired before the cold deepened. Tom and Pete were with them. Cal had ridden to Red Hollow for supplies. Jessie was in the stable loft, which she knew, and Delia had gone to visit her sister in town, which was a monthly arrangement. She was in the office reviewing the month's accounts. The numbers looked better than they had any time in the previous 2 years, which gave her a quiet satisfaction when she heard the horses. More than one. Multiple. Coming up the road at a pace that was not the ordinary pace of men returning from work. She went to the front window and looked out. There were 5 of them. She didn't recognize 4. The 5th, in the middle, she recognized from the north water source, wide-shouldered, dark-haired, the man who was not from this territory. He had something in his hand that she understood, even before she fully processed it, was a torch. They were not stopping at the gate. She moved. She went to the office and got the key from the desk drawer and locked the document folder in the safe that was behind the office shelving. The safe she had organized and cataloged in her 3rd week on the ranch. She moved fast, but not running, because running is the movement of someone who is not thinking, and she was thinking. Then she went to the kitchen. She got Delia's cast iron pan off the hook and set it on the stove, not because she needed it there, but because the action of moving it grounded her hands. She looked out the kitchen window toward the barn. Jessie. She went to the back door and opened it and called out, not loud enough to reach the men on the road, but enough to carry to the stable. "Jessie, come to the house. Right now." A pause. Then Jessie's head appeared from the stable door. He took one look at her face. "What?" "Now," she said. "Don't run. Walk like nothing's happening." He did. He was 17 and not always reliable in the mornings. But he was not stupid, and he could read the situation in her posture, if not yet in the full scene. He came into the kitchen, and she closed the door and turned the lock. 5 men coming up the road, she said. At least one of them works for Sutton. She looked at him directly. There are horses in the barn. 6, he said. He had gone slightly pale, but his voice was steady. The breeding stock in the east paddock? 4 of them, including Aldridge. He had only been back in the paddock 2 days, his first time out of the barn since the poisoning. She went to the front hallway and got the old Winchester from the rack above the coat pegs. She had noticed it her first week and had asked Rowan about it, and he had told her it was kept loaded. She checked it. It was loaded, and went back to the kitchen. Are any of the hands close? She asked Jesse. Hector and Rowan are north. That's 40 minutes on foot. He looked at the Winchester. I can ride. You're not going out that door. She looked at the kitchen window. The men had reached the yard. The one with the torch was speaking to the others, gesturing toward the barn. Is there a back way to the paddock from here without crossing the yard? Jesse thought. Through the root cellar and under the fence at the south side. It's tight, but show me. They went through the kitchen to the root cellar door. Jesse lifted it, and she followed him through, and they moved under the floorboards in a crouch. She was aware of the sounds above them, boots on porch boards, voices she couldn't fully make out, and came up through a hatch at the base of the vegetable garden on the far side of the house from where the men were gathered. From here, crouched behind the garden fence, she could see the full yard. 2 men were moving toward the barn. The wide one was still in the yard, watching. The other 2 were near the front of the house. One of them was reaching into a bag he'd brought off the saddle. She looked at the barn. She looked at the paddock beyond it, where she could make out Aldridge's dark shape against the lighter grass. She made a decision. Go back inside, she told Jesse. Lock the root cellar from the inside. Do not come out until you hear Rowan's voice. You can't, Jesse. She looked at him directly. I need you inside where I know you're safe. I need that to be certain so I can focus on what I'm doing. Do you understand? He looked at her, 16 going on 17, with the particular combination of wanting to be brave and knowing where actual usefulness lay. Yes, he said. He went. She moved. She went along the garden fence line and then cut through the gap behind the equipment shed and came out at the east side of the barn without crossing the open yard. The 2 men heading for the barn had not yet reached it. They were arguing in low voices about something. She could hear the argument's tone without the words. One of them didn't want to do something the other one was insisting on. That was useful information. Division meant uncertainty. She went to the barn side door and slipped inside. The barn was dark and smelled of horses and hay, and the particular mineral smell of animals that have been afraid recently and have not fully stopped being afraid. She could hear Aldridge in the paddock outside, the familiar sound of him moving. She went to the paddock gate from inside the barn and opened it quietly and found him in the dark by sound and by the warmth of him. He turned his head toward her, and she put her hand on his neck, steady, familiar, the hand that had fed him and checked on him during the long sick days. And he did not shy. Easy, she said. Easy. She guided him back through the paddock gate into the barn, into the far stall, and latched it. If the barn burned, she set that thought aside and focused on the next part. She went to the barn loft ladder. She climbed. From the loft, through the gap in the boards where the ventilation slats were, she could see the east side of the yard. The 2 men from the barn were now at the barn door, the main door, which she had not come through. She heard the latch being tried. She raised the Winchester. She was not going to shoot anyone. She was going to make enough presence and enough noise that the calculation these men were operating on, empty ranch, woman alone, no one to stop us, was no longer accurate. And she was going to do it loudly enough that if Hector or Rowan were anywhere within a half-mile of the north property line, they would hear it. She fired once into the roof beam above the barn door. The crack of it in the October night was enormous. The 2 men at the barn door fell back. She heard shouting from the yard. She racked the lever and fired again into the same beam, not at the men, above them, and called out in the clearest and most carrying voice she had. This is private property. I have 8 rounds left, and the next one doesn't go in the wood. She was aware that 8 rounds was not accurate. She didn't think they would count. Silence from below. Then the wide-shouldered man's voice from the yard. Come out of there, woman. You're making this harder than it needs to be. You're on private property with a torch, she said. I'm making it exactly as hard as it needs to be. She moved to the other side of the loft so her voice was coming from a different position. Old trick. She'd read it somewhere, or heard it, and it turned out to be the kind of information that has no clear origin but feels right in the moment. Who sent you? No answer. My guess is Gerald Sutton, she said, to the dark and the 5 men in it. And my guess is Gerald Sutton didn't tell you about the folder in the safe, or the letter to the Territorial Land Office, or the independent surveyor coming from Denver. She paused, letting that settle. Because if he had, you'd know you're not burning a ranch. You're burning a legal case that already has your employer's name on it, which means you're not protecting anyone. You're just creating a witness problem for yourselves. Long silence. Then the wide-shouldered man's voice, quieter. She's bluffing. A different voice, one of the others. Are you sure about that? Another silence. Longer. Then she heard the horses moving. Not toward the barn, away. The receding sound of 5 riders at speed heading south, growing smaller until it was gone. She stayed in the loft for 2 full minutes after the sound disappeared, because leaving too soon was how you discovered they'd only gone to the edge of the property. Then she climbed down and checked the barn door. Intact, unlatch attempt, but no damage, and went to Aldridge's stall. He looked at her with his large dark eyes in the dim light, head over the stall gate, entirely calm in the way large animals sometimes are when a danger they couldn't see has passed. You're all right, she told him. Her voice, she noticed, was not quite steady. She sat down on the hay bale beside his stall and held the Winchester across her knees and waited. Rowan and Hector and Tom arrived at 9:20, having heard the shots from the north fence line and ridden back at a speed she could read in the state of the horses when they came through the gate. She heard Rowan's voice calling her name from the yard, the first time she had heard her name in his voice in that particular register where the control over it was not quite complete, and she got up and went to the barn door and opened it. He was standing in the yard with a lantern, coat open from riding fast, and when he saw her, the expression on his face was something she had not seen there before. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than relief. I'm fine, she said. He crossed the yard in 4 steps and stopped in front of her, and for a moment he just looked at her, cataloging, she thought, the way you catalog things you were afraid you'd lost. The horses, in the barn. Aldridge is in the far stall. He's fine. She held the Winchester out to him. I fired twice into the roof beam. There are marks you'll want to know about. He took the rifle. He was still looking at her face. Vivian. I'm all right, she said again, more gently. Truly. He looked at her for another moment. Then he put one hand on the side of her face, briefly. Not a gesture that required anything from her, just a contact, just the confirmation that she was there. And then he stepped back, and the professional competence of him reassembled, and he turned to assess the yard and call out to Hector. But she held that moment, standing in the cold barn doorway, with the lamplight from Hector's lantern making gold against the dark October grass. And she understood that she had just received an answer to the question she had set aside at 5 a.m. 3 weeks ago, the 4th unanswerable one. She thought she had also given one. Nobody slept much that night. Hector walked the full perimeter of the property twice before midnight and once more before dawn, which was not something Vivian had asked him to do and not something Rowan had assigned him. He simply did it, the way a man does a thing when the thing needs doing and he is the person capable of doing it. She heard his boots on the porch each time he passed and found, in that small recurring sound, something that steadied her more than she would have expected. Jesse came out of the root cellar at 9:30 when Rowan called for him and spent the next hour being very quiet in the way of someone who has been frightened and is processing it on the inside. Vivian found him in the kitchen after Rowan had finished talking to him and set a plate of bread and cold chicken in front of him without comment. He ate it without comment. They sat in the kitchen together for a while without needing to fill the time with anything, which was its own kind of conversation. You did right, she said finally. Going back inside when I asked. Jesse looked at the plate. I wanted to help. You did help. I knew where you were. That helped. He thought about this for a moment with the focused seriousness of someone for whom the distinction between helping and wanting to help was new and somewhat difficult. Okay, he said. She went back to the office. Rowan came in around 11, when the property had been checked twice, and the horses settled and the hands given what direction they could be given for the next day. He sat in the chair across from the desk and looked at her with the remnant of whatever had been on his face in the yard. Dimmer now, but not gone. "Tell me again," he said. "All of it. Everything they said, the order they moved, what made them leave." She told him. He listened the same way he always listened, fully, without interrupting except once when she mentioned the wide-shouldered man's voice from the yard, and then he just said the man's name, Driscoll, as though confirming something. When she finished, he was quiet. "The surveyor argument," he said. "The folder in the safe. The territorial office." "Yes." "You weren't certain any of it would work." "No," she said honestly. "I thought there was a reasonable chance it would. Men who do this kind of work on contract don't love uncertainty. They want to know the risk they're absorbing." She paused. "I gave them a version of the risk that was large enough to recalculate." "But you weren't certain." "I'm rarely certain about anything," she said. "I just try to make uncertainty work in a useful direction." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something he wanted to say. She could see it, the particular quality of a person holding something carefully, deciding how much of it to give. "When I heard the shots," he said, and then he stopped. She waited. "I've been afraid before," he said, "on this ranch, for this ranch. Lost animals, bad winters, the water dispute." He looked at the desk. That was different. She held what he'd said carefully, the way you hold something that has weight and you want to make sure you're bearing it correctly. "I know," she said quietly. "I don't think you should be out there alone again." She looked at him. "Rowan, I'm not saying I know you handled it. I know that's not the question." He looked at her directly, with the frustrated honesty of someone who knows the words aren't coming out right and is trying anyway. "I'm saying I don't want you out there alone because of what it was like to hear those shots and not be here." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a feeling I understand." "Is it?" "Every morning you go to the south fence or the north quarter or wherever the problem is that day. I am here working, and I know you're out there, and Yes." She looked at the ledger in front of her. "It's a feeling I understand." The office was very quiet. The lamp on the desk was the only light. Outside, the October dark was complete, and the wind was coming up. "The 3 months end next week," he said. "Tuesday," she said. She had been aware of this with increasing precision for the past 10 days. "I know you know that." "I know you know I know." He almost smiled. Almost. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to be aware of that before whatever happens next." "At what specifically?" "Saying things that matter." He looked at his hands. "Claire used to say I operated 3 conversations behind where I actually was. That by the time I said what I was feeling, the moment had usually passed." He paused. She was correct. "You've been fairly direct with me," Vivian said. "I've been direct about practical things." He looked up at her. "This isn't practical." "No," she agreed. Another silence. She was aware of her own heart in a way she usually wasn't. She was also aware that she was doing the things she'd promised herself she wouldn't do, assigning weight to a feeling before she had enough information to carry it safely. But she had also fired a rifle twice into the dark to protect this man's horses, and sat in a barn loft telling herself she was not afraid when she was in fact afraid. And that was also a kind of information. "I don't want you to leave," he said. Just that, plain and direct, and with none of the ornamentation that would have made it easier but less true. She looked at him. "I haven't decided to leave." "I know. I'm not asking you to decide tonight." He held her gaze. "I'm just telling you where I am, 3 conversations past where I should have said it." She looked at him for a long time, at the weathered face and the dark eyes and the hands on the chair arms that were not performing calmness, but actually were calm, in the way of someone who has said the thing and is now prepared to hold whatever comes back. "I haven't decided to leave," she said again, differently this time, with a weight in it that was not ambiguity. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled enough to move past. He stood. "I'm going to check the perimeter once more," he said. "Hector just came through." "I know." He picked up his coat from the chair back. "I'll sleep better for it." She understood. "All right," she said. He went. She sat at the desk for a while longer, the lamp making its small circle of light around the accounts and the folder of documentation that she had built over 10 weeks into something that had, that evening, turned 5 men with a torch back into the dark. She sat with the accounts and the lamp and the sound of the wind outside, and did not try to resolve anything that wasn't ready to be resolved. Then she banked the lamp and went to bed. What happened next happened fast, and then slow, and then fast again, in the way that legal and official processes move when they finally get moving, which is to say, with an initial burst of energy that then encounters the enormous friction of institutional process, and then breaks through it all at once at the end in a way that feels both sudden and long overdue. The morning after the attack, Rowan rode to Red Hollow and went directly past Sheriff Dunmore's office to the telegraph office and sent 3 telegrams, one to Alderman in Cheyenne, one to the Territorial Land Office contact Garrett, and one to the Denver newspaper that covered Wyoming territorial affairs, because Vivian had suggested this, and he had thought about it for half a mile and decided she was right. The newspaper? He'd asked when she'd suggested it the previous night. Sutton can pressure Dunmore. He cannot pressure a newspaper in Denver that has no local obligations. She'd looked at him. You're not making accusations in the telegram. You're notifying them that there was an incident of trespass and attempted arson at a property involved in an active territorial land dispute. That's factual. They'll decide whether it's a story. And if they decide it is, then Sutton has a problem that money and local influence can't solve. He had thought about this. You think like a general, he'd said. I think like someone who grew up without resources, she'd said. It's similar, but with worse equipment. The Denver paper sent a correspondent. He arrived on Friday, a young man named Albright, not the postmaster Albright, a different Albright, who had the eager and slightly rumpled quality of someone who believed deeply in the importance of what he was doing and hadn't yet been adequately disappointed to stop. He came to the ranch, and Vivian sat with him in the kitchen while Delia made enough noise with the pots to be clearly present, and Rowan sat in the doorway in the particular way of a man who is not supervising but is aware of everything. She gave Albright the facts. Just the facts. In order. With dates and documentation where available. The fence cutting. The water contamination with Doc Marsh's written assessment. The trespass. The 5 men with the torch. The coordinate discrepancy in the original water rights complaint. The independent surveyor who is now scheduled to arrive from Denver in 2 weeks. She did not say Gerald Sutton's name until Albright asked her directly. The adjacent property is registered to Gerald Sutton of Red Hollow, she said. The trespassers came from the south, which is the Sutton property line direction. I have no direct evidence connecting Mr. Sutton to the specific men who came onto this property. What I have is a documented pattern of incidents that began when this ranch filed a formal challenge to a water rights complaint that I believe contains a deliberate survey error. She looked at Albright steadily. I'd encourage you to look at the coordinate discrepancy yourself and draw your own conclusions. She had made a copy of the relevant documents. She gave him the copies. Albright looked at them. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who has found something more substantial than they expected. These are pretty clear, he said. Yes, she said. They are. Rowan, from the doorway. We'd appreciate accurate reporting, not embellishment, not dramatization, just what the documents show. Albright looked at him. That's all I do, he said, with the mild offense of the young. Good, Rowan said. Then we'll get along. After Albright left, Delia put a pot of coffee on the table and sat down across from Vivian in a way that was itself unusual. Delia sat down with intention, not as a side effect of doing other things. You handled that well, Delia said. He's a reporter, Vivian said. You just give reporters the documents and let them read. Most people give reporters the emotion, Delia said, and then they're surprised when it comes out wrong. Vivian looked at her. You've dealt with reporters before? My first husband was a newspaper editor, Delia said. She said this in the same matter-of-fact way she reported supply quantities, as though it were equally routine. In St. Louis, before I came west. She poured her own cup. He taught me that the story is in the documents, not the feelings. Feelings change what you remember. Documents don't. Vivian looked at her for a moment. 11 weeks into her time on the ranch, and Delia was still offering new information about herself at the rate of approximately 1 significant revelation per month. I didn't know that, she said. You didn't ask, Delia said pleasantly, and went back to her stove. Rowan appeared in the kitchen door. He looked between them. What was that? Delia was a newspaper editor's wife, Vivian said. He looked at Delia. You never told me that. You never asked, Delia said. He opened his mouth and then closed it, which was the appropriate response. The independent surveyor, Park, arrived from Denver on the 15th of November, a week later than expected, because the rail connection through Laramie had been delayed by early snow. He was a compact, methodical man in his 40s who examined the relevant property lines and water sources over 3 days with a thoroughness that made Vivian feel, for the first time since the folder had started filling, that the methodical approach was going to be sufficient. Park's findings, delivered in a written report that he completed in the ranch office on the evening of the 3rd day, were clear. The coordinate error in the original water rights complaint was not a natural survey mistake. The deviation was too specific and too directionally convenient. It placed the property line precisely 200 yards in Sutton's favor at the point where the earthwork diversion had been constructed. A natural measurement error of that magnitude, Park noted, would have been distributed randomly, not targeted. In your professional opinion, Vivian said, when he read this section, is this actionable? In my professional opinion, Park said, the question is not whether it's actionable. It clearly is. The question is whether the territorial court will move on it given local political relationships. He looked at her over his reading glasses. Do you have a lawyer? Alderman in Cheyenne. Good man, Park said. Tell him I said the evidence is solid. He'll know what that means from me specifically. He left on the 16th. His report went into the folder, which was now thick enough to require a second folder, and both folders went into the safe, and copies of everything went to Alderman by the next post. The Denver paper ran its story on the 19th. It ran on the front page of the Territorial Affairs section under a headline that was factual and dry, and for that reason, devastating to anyone who read the documents it referenced. Survey error. Favors neighboring ranch in Wyoming. In water rights dispute. Independent assessment contradicts county filing. The article named Sutton directly, with the careful attribution of adjacent property owner and subject of the survey discrepancy finding, which was accurate in a way that was worse than any accusation. Vivian read it at the kitchen table the morning it arrived, with Rowan across from her and Delia at the stove, and the smell of November cold coming through the gap under the back door that they kept meaning to seal. She read it once, then set it down. It's accurate, she said. Yes, Rowan said. He had already read it. She could tell from the way he was holding his coffee, with the particular stillness of someone who has received news they expected but which still requires a moment. Alderman will have it by now too, she said, and Garrett at the territorial office. She paused. Sutton won't be able to bury the local filing anymore. It's public. He'll have a lawyer by this afternoon, Rowan said. I expect so. She looked at the paper. That's fine. Lawyers work with documents. We have better documents. He looked at her across the table. Something in his face was different this morning. Not the controlled urgency of the past weeks, but something that had released slightly, like a load shifted to a better position. Not gone. Redistributed. How are you? He asked. Not about the article. About her generally. She considered this honestly. Tired, she said, but the functional kind. Not the other kind? I've been the other kind, she said. This isn't it. He nodded slowly. You? She asked. He looked at the paper again. I've been fighting this man for 4 years and never had anything solid enough to stand on, he said. Now I have 2 folders and a Denver correspondent and an independent surveyor's report. He paused. I keep waiting for it to feel more like winning. It doesn't feel like winning yet because it's not finished yet, she said. Winning feels different. It feels like the absence of needing to do the next thing. She wrapped her hands around her cup. We still need to do the next thing. What's the next thing? Write to Alderman. Tell him Park said the evidence is solid, and to know what that means from Park specifically. She stood and took her cup to the window. Outside, the November grass was gray-brown and the sky was the flat white of high clouds carrying cold. And wait. Sutton's going to respond, either legally or otherwise, and we need to be ready for both. You think he'll try something else? She looked at the yard, the gate, the road south. I think a man who's been operating without consequences for 4 years and suddenly finds himself on the front page of a Denver paper is a man who's afraid. She turned. Afraid men make decisions quickly, and those decisions aren't always good ones. Rowan looked at her. You could have left 2 weeks ago, he said. The 3 months ended Tuesday. She looked at him. I know when they ended. You didn't say anything. Neither did you. He was quiet. No, he said. I didn't. A pause. Because I was afraid that if I raised it, you'd have to decide, and if you decided to go... He stopped, started again. I didn't want to force the question before you were ready, and I told myself that was consideration, but I think it was also cowardice. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the November cold was outside where it belonged, and Delia had gone tactfully to the far side of the kitchen and was doing something emphatic with a mixing bowl. It wasn't cowardice, she said. You were giving me time. Was it enough time? She looked at him. I'm still here, she said. That's not the same as an answer. No, she agreed. It's better than an answer. An answer is a word. Being here is a fact. He looked at her with an expression she had catalogued and recatalogued over 11 weeks and still couldn't fully name, something that was looking and something that was deciding and something that was, underneath both of those, simply feeling, plain and uncomplicated and human. Vivian, he said. I know, she said. I haven't said it. I know what you're going to say. Then let me say it anyway. He stood, and when he stood, Delia became even more emphatic with the mixing bowl, which was, Vivian thought, the most Delia thing that had ever happened. I am not a man who... He stopped, started again. I've been trying to find the right way to say this for 6 weeks, and I don't think there is a right way, so I'm going to say it in whatever way comes out, and you can judge it for what it is. He looked at her directly, with the full honest directness that she had found unsettling the first day and had come to find, over 11 weeks, like something she needed in the way you need water or sleep. I love you. I don't know when that became true. I think it was earlier than I knew. But it's true now, and it's not going to stop being true if you leave. And I'd rather know that you know it than not say it, and have it just be something that sits between us. The kitchen was very quiet. The mixing bowl had gone still. She looked at him. She thought about Gerald Sutton's platform, and the $41, and the 41-day train ride she'd built a future on that had dissolved in 4 words. She thought about the careful, analytical distance she had maintained and the ways it had been, incrementally and persistently, insufficient. She thought about 5 in the morning in the kitchen and the barn loft, with the Winchester and the document folder in the safe, and the word we that kept coming out before she remembered to qualify it. She thought about what it meant to know a person, not the performed version of a person, not the version in letters, but the actual person, their 5 a.m. silences and their 3 conversations behind honesty and the way they sat with a sick horse for 2 hours in the dark because they couldn't sleep and didn't know what else to do. I know it, she said quietly. I've known it for a while. And I love you too, she said, which I am aware is terrible timing given that we currently have an active legal dispute, a Denver reporter, and an angry man who sent 5 people with a torch to our barn. Something crossed his face, startlement at first, and then, through it, something warm and almost undone. Our barn, he said. She looked at him. I noticed. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, which was a longer distance than it should have been since the kitchen wasn't large. And when he reached her, he put both hands on her face and looked at her for a moment, the way you look at something you thought you might have lost and didn't, and are still not entirely sure is real. And then he kissed her, quietly and carefully, with the same focused quality he brought to everything that mattered to him. The mixing bowl behind them stayed silent. When they separated, she kept her hands on his arms and looked at him and said, Delia. I know, he said, from across the kitchen. I'm not here, Delia said. I am entirely elsewhere. Thank you, Delia, Vivian said. Don't thank me, Delia said. I've been waiting for this for 6 weeks, and it's a relief to have it settled so I can stop pretending not to notice things. What Vivian had said about afraid men making quick bad decisions turned out to be accurate. On the 22nd of November, Gerald Sutton made 2 of them in the same day. The first was sending his lawyer, a man named Croft from Laramie, who was competent but not exceptional, to file a counterclaim with the county asserting that the survey discrepancy had been a clerical error during the original filing and had already been identified and corrected internally, which was demonstrably false, and which Alderman, when notified, described in his return telegram as an assertion that will not survive contact with the actual documents. The second was going to the Red Hollow Saloon on the evening of the 22nd and talking loudly in front of 7 witnesses about what he intended to do to the Callaway Ranch and the woman running it. He used language that did not bear repeating. The 7 witnesses included Pete Danner's brother-in-law, who told Rowan at 6 the next morning before Vivian was fully awake. Rowan came upstairs and knocked on her door and told her when she opened it, standing in the hallway in the gray morning light. And she listened to what Sutton had said with her face doing the careful, neutral thing it did when she was organizing something internally. "He said this in front of 7 people," she said. "At least 7. Could be more. Does Dunmore know?" "I was in the saloon," Rowan said. "Not at that end of it, but in the building." She was quiet for a moment. "Get their names," she said. "All 7. Written statements if they'll give them. If they won't write them, written accounts of what they said verbally." She looked at him. Sutton just made a public threatening statement about an identified person in front of multiple witnesses, including a law enforcement officer who took no action. That's not just testimony about character. That's Dunmore's inaction being documented. Rowan looked at her with an expression that was, for him, something close to startled. "You can use Dunmore's inaction. Garrett at the territorial office can use it," she said. "I'll draft the letter today." He looked at her in the hallway in the morning light, this woman who had arrived 3 months ago with $41 and a broken arrangement and had built, from the available materials of careful attention and organized thinking, a legal case that was actively dismantling a 4-year campaign of harassment. He looked at her and felt something that was past admiration and past love, and into a territory he didn't quite have a word for, the feeling of being permanently changed by someone's presence, of not being able to imagine the before version of yourself as the full version anymore. "Good morning," he said. She looked at him. The neutrality dropped slightly, and she almost smiled. "Good morning," she said. So they went downstairs. Pete came back that afternoon with 4 written statements and the verbal accounts of 2 more witnesses who wouldn't put pen to paper but had described clearly what they'd heard. The letter to Garrett went out the next morning. Garrett's response came in 9 days, which was fast enough that Vivian understood he had been watching this situation closely and was ready to move. He was sending a territorial investigator to Red Hollow. The investigation would cover the water rights filing discrepancy, the documented incidents at the Callaway Ranch, and the public threatening statement made by Gerald Sutton on the evening of the 22nd, witnessed by a county law enforcement officer who had taken no formal action. Sheriff Dunmore, when the territorial investigator arrived, was visibly uncomfortable in the specific way of a man who has made choices over a long period that seemed individually defensible but do not look good assembled together in a room. The investigator's name was Harlan. He was from Cheyenne, 50-something, and had the quality of a person who had heard every version of every story and was interested only in what the document said. He went through the folder, both folders, with the same focused attention Park had brought to the survey lines. He interviewed Vivian for 2 hours in the ranch office, Rowan for an hour, Hector for 40 minutes, Doc Marsh in town for 30. He did not interview Sutton directly. He interviewed Croft, Sutton's lawyer, who apparently had not been told about the full scope of the documentation before he filed the counterclaim, because Croft's interview, according to Pete's brother-in-law, who had a friend who worked in the building where it was conducted, lasted 20 minutes and ended with Croft looking like a man who had recently understood something he wished he'd understood earlier. Vivian heard this account and said nothing, but she filed it away with the private satisfaction of someone who has been called, over the course of 3 months, various things by various people in this town, and is finding that the facts are doing the work that anger never could have. On the 3rd of December, Harlan delivered his preliminary findings to the territorial office in Cheyenne. The survey discrepancy was deliberate and actionable. The documented incidents at the Callaway Ranch constituted a pattern of harassment with sufficient evidential basis to pursue civil action, and the county law enforcement response to the incidents was inadequate in a manner that warranted further review. Alderman wrote to say that Sutton's counterclaim had been formally rejected. The water rights case was proceeding to the territorial court. Timeline, he estimated, was 3 to 5 months. Rowan read this at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, Vivian across from him, Delia conspicuously somewhere else. 3 to 5 months, he said. For the formal resolution, she said. The pattern is already established. Even if it takes 5 months, he can't do anything else without it becoming part of the record. She paused. He's effectively contained. Rowan set the letter down and looked at her. You did this, he said. We did this, she said. Vivian. The documentation mattered because you kept records even when they weren't organized. The legal challenge was possible because you'd already filed in 1875 even when Dunmore buried it. The breeding program was worth defending because you built it over 3 years. She looked at him directly. I organized what was already here. You made it usable, he said. Yes, she allowed. That's what I did. He was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to not answer it the practical way first. She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved. All right. Will you marry me? It was not quite a question in its intonation, more like a statement that was also a question, the way direct people sometimes speak when they've thought about something long enough that the answer feels to them already obvious, and they're checking to confirm. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the December cold outside, and the folder in the safe in the office, and 11 weeks of evenings on the porch, and 3 months of learning what it meant to actually know someone rather than to know the version of them they sent in letters. She thought about the train platform, and the $41, and the not-quite smile that had been the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet, and had turned out, over time, to have a very simple and accurate name. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Just looked, the way he had at the barn door after the night with the torch, cataloging, confirming, making sure of something. Then, the practical version is that it also simplifies the legal standing for the property case. She stared at him. He held for exactly 2 seconds, and then something happened to his face that she had almost never seen, a full, unguarded smile, without the containment he usually applied to it. It changed his whole face. She made a note to see it more often. That was a joke, he said. A terrible one, she said. I know. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. But you smiled. I did not. You did. She looked at him. She had in fact smiled. She was aware of it. She chose not to confirm it because some things were better let stand without narration. Tuesday, she said. What? That's when I'll want to talk to Alderman about the property implications, she said. Give me until Tuesday. He looked at her. Then, Vivian. I know, she said. I know that was the practical version. She turned her hand over under his so they were holding properly, with the full intention of it. I said yes before the practical version. You did, he said. Hold on to that, she said. I intend to, he said. For a long time. Outside, the December wind moved through the gray-brown grass, and the sky was enormous and cold and full of stars that had no interest in the particular human arrangements below them, but were present anyway, witness to everything, indifferent and permanent and very beautiful. Inside, the kitchen lamp burned low. In the stable, Aldridge, recovered, strong, moving through his paddock with the easy authority of a horse that knows its own worth, shook his head once in the dark and settled into the warmth of the stall. In the morning, Vivian would write the letter to Alderman. She would update the folders. She would adjust the winter feed schedule for the 3rd time because the snow was coming in sooner than projected. She would have a conversation with Hector about the spring breeding rotation and one with Delia about whether the pantry shelving needed replacing before February. She would do all of these things because they were the things that needed doing, and she was someone who did what needed doing, and because the Callaway Ranch was hers now in the way that things become yours, not through documents, though the documents would follow, but through the daily presence of care, through knowing where the Eastgate latch stuck, and what Jesse's expression meant when he was covering up being frightened, and how Hector preferred to be asked rather than told, and what Aldridge's breathing sounded like when he was calm. Through the particular way a place gets into you when you've worked for it and worried about it and stayed when leaving would have been easier. She was not the woman from the platform anymore. Not exactly. That woman had been competent and determined and carrying herself across the gap between a lost future and an unknown one. She was still those things. She was also now something additional, rooted, in the specific way of someone who has put down roots not because they ran out of places to go, but because they found the place worth putting them, That was, she thought, the difference. And the man across the table, holding her hand with the same uncomplicated certainty he brought to the fence line and the breeding program and the words he'd said 3 conversations behind when they were already true, that man was a substantial part of the reason for it. Not all of it. She was clear about that. She had built something here that was hers regardless of what anyone else had done. But he was a substantial part. She thought he knew that. She thought that was exactly right. The letter to Alderman went out on Tuesday, as promised, and by the time Vivian sealed the envelope and handed it to Jessie to take to the post office, she had also revised the winter feed schedule, confirmed the pantry shelving order with Delia, and written a separate note to Park in Denver requesting a formal copy of his survey report for the ranch's permanent records. She did all of this before breakfast. Rowan watched her from the kitchen doorway with his coffee and said nothing, because he had learned over the past 3 months that commenting on her efficiency was something she received the way most people receive someone pointing out that they're breathing. Acknowledged, mildly unnecessary. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "The thing where you finish 3 things before I've started one." She looked up from the note. "You started the south fence repair at 5 this morning. That's not nothing." "The fence doesn't require thinking." "Everything requires thinking," she said. "You just think with your hands sometimes." He looked at her over his coffee. "Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation," she said. "I think with paper. You think with work. Between us, we cover most of the ground." He was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the kitchen window in the particular thin way of December, making everything look outlined. "Between us," he said, the same way he'd noted our barn. Not possessive, just accurate, and aware of the accuracy. "Yes," she said, and went back to the note. What she did not say, because she was not someone who said things before they were properly formed, was that the phrase "between us" had taken on a weight in the past week that was different from its earlier weight. Earlier, it had been practical, 2 people managing a problem. Now it was something that included the practical, but was larger than it, the way a river includes the water you're standing in, but is also everything upstream. She was still being careful about that. Not because she doubted it. She had stopped doubting it somewhere around the barn loft in the Winchester, but because careful was her nature, and caring about something made her more careful, not less. The territorial court proceedings began in February, 4 months after Harlan's preliminary findings, which was faster than Alderman's estimate and slower than Vivian would have preferred, though she said neither of these things to anyone. They rode to Cheyenne on a Tuesday in a hired coach. Rowan and Vivian and Alderman's requested documentation, both folders, and now a third that had accumulated since December, thick with correspondence and survey reports, and the written statements of 7 witnesses, and Doc Marsh's signed assessment, and the Denver Papers article, and Harlan's official findings. She had organized everything chronologically within each folder and created a summary index on the cover page of each one so that any lawyer or judge who opened them could find what they needed in under 2 minutes. Alderman met them at the courthouse steps. He was a trim man in his 60s with a face that communicated he had been doing this for a long time and still found it interesting, which she respected. He looked at the 3 folders she carried. "You organized these?" he asked. "Yes." He took the first folder, opened it, looked at the index, and closed it again. "I've been practicing law for 38 years, he said. "No client has ever given me organized documentation." "Did it help?" she asked. "It helps considerably," he said, with the slightly surprised tone of a man adjusting an expectation. The proceedings themselves were not dramatic in the way of fiction. No single thunderclap moment, no villain collapsing under cross-examination. They were the quieter drama of accumulated evidence meeting organized presentation in front of a judge who had clearly read Harlan's report and formed a view before the first argument was made. Croft, Sutton's lawyer, had been replaced by a more senior man from Laramie named Eakins, who was competent and cautious, and knew, Vivian thought from watching him, that he was arguing uphill. She sat in the gallery beside Rowan through 4 hours of legal argument, and at 2 points she passed notes to Alderman through the gallery rail. Small corrections of fact, references to specific documents, which Alderman used without attribution, as they had agreed. Rowan watched this process once and then watched it again, and then leaned close and said quietly, "You're arguing the case from the gallery." "I'm providing accurate information," she murmured back. "That's arguing the case." "Then Alderman is arguing the case. I'm providing accurate information. He looked at her sideways. That distinction is very narrow. It's sufficient, she said, and passed another note. The judge's ruling came down in full 3 weeks later, in a written decision that aldermen sent by post, and that arrived on a Wednesday morning when Vivian was in the office updating the spring budget projections. Rowan brought it in from the gate where the postwriter had left it and set it on the desk in front of her without opening it, which was his way of saying that this was hers as much as his, and he wanted her present for it. She opened it. The water rights filing discrepancy was ruled deliberate falsification. The original complaint was vacated. The Callaway Ranch's 3 water sources were confirmed as legally protected under the original property deed. Sutton was ordered to remove the earthwork diversion, the one constructed in 1875 and documented by Harlan, within 60 days at his own expense. He was also ordered to pay a civil penalty to the territorial court for the pattern of documented harassment, the amount of which was sufficient to cover the Callaway Ranch's full legal costs with a balance remaining. There was a separate notation regarding Sheriff Dunmore's conduct, which did not result in formal charges, but which recommended review by the county board. Dunmore, Vivian would learn later through Pete's brother-in-law's network, quietly retired in March. A replacement was appointed in April, a younger man from the eastern part of the territory with no existing relationships in Red Hollow. She read the decision twice. Then she set it down on the desk. "Well," she said. Rowan was reading it over her shoulder. He straightened up. He didn't say anything for a moment. "It's done," he said. "The legal part," she said. "Yes." "What other part is there?" She looked at the decision. "The part where we figure out what we actually want to do with the ranch now that we're not spending half our energy defending it." She looked up at him. "I have some ideas about that." He looked at her with that expression she'd stopped trying to categorize and had started simply accepting as the way he looked at her. "I expect you do," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I'll tell you." He sat down. She told him. The 60 days came and went. The earthwork was removed by Sutton's men. Sutton himself was not present, which was information in its own way. And the water flow to the Callaway Ranch's eastern sources returned to its natural pattern within 2 weeks of the removal, which was faster than Doc Marsh had predicted, and which pleased Hector in the specific way that the restoration of a natural thing pleases someone who has been watching it run wrong for years. Gerald Sutton did not leave Red Hollow, which Vivian had half expected. He was not the kind of man who left. He was the kind of man who contracted, quietly and bitterly, into a smaller version of himself and continued to exist in the place he'd always existed, but with less air in the room. She saw him twice in the spring, once at the Mercantile, once from across the street, and both times he looked through her the way he'd looked through her on the platform, except now the looking through was not dismissal, but something closer to the opposite, the focused non-acknowledgement of a man who is very aware of what he's looking past. She found she did not feel what she might have expected to feel. Not triumph, particularly. Not satisfaction in the sharp sense. Something more like the feeling of a wound that has healed over. Not the wound's absence, because you can still feel the scar, but the fundamental shift from acute to past. What he had done to her on that platform had been a humiliation. She did not pretend otherwise. He had discarded her in public like something with an inconvenient value, and the people of Red Hollow had watched it happen, and she had had to carry that in her spine for months while doing her work and holding her ground, and proving one careful day at a time that she was considerably more than what he'd decided she was worth. That was not nothing. That had cost something. But the thing she had understood slowly, over the months of building the documentation and sitting in the Cheyenne Gallery and watching the legal structure that he'd abused for 4 years finally turn against him. The thing she'd come to understand was that Gerald Sutton had never actually seen her. On the platform, or before it, or after it. He had seen the image she could serve, first as a mail-order bride, then as an inconvenience, then as an opponent. He had never seen Vivian Ashcroft, the specific woman, the one who thought with paper and woke early and had learned to fix a shutter from a 16-year-old boy. That was his loss, not hers. It was also, in a way she'd taken some time to fully arrive at, his fundamental limitation, the inability to see people as people rather than as positions on a board. It had made him dangerous for a while. It had also made him, ultimately, predictable. He had moved the pieces he always moved because he could not imagine the board looking different, and she had been able to work around him in part precisely because she saw things he didn't know were there. She thought about this on a May morning, standing at the north water source that was now running clean and clear and unobstructed, with the spring grass coming in green around it, and the mountain air still cold enough to see her breath. She was not there for any specific purpose. She had come out early, before the house was fully awake, because she liked the north pasture in the morning, and she had earned the right to simply stand somewhere she liked for no reason other than that. She heard Rowan's boots in the grass behind her and did not turn around. He came to stand beside her. He had his coffee. He offered it without speaking, and she took it and drank and gave it back. They stood there for a while. "Jesse's asking about going to agricultural college," he said eventually. "I know. He told me 2 weeks ago." She looked at the water. "He's good enough to go. You should tell him so." "I have." A pause. "He asked if you thought he should." She turned to look at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you himself." She looked back at the water. "Why?" "Because you're the one who taught him to think about things systematically," Rowan said. "He trusts your judgment on education more than mine. I never went past the basics." A pause. "You should take that as what it is." "What is it?" "Evidence," he said, "of what you've built here. Not what we built. What you specifically built. In the people." She was quiet for a moment. The water ran clean over the stones. "Hector's son is coming in August," she said. "He's 17. Hector hasn't said directly, but he wants to train him for the operation." "I know. I'm planning to offer him a position." "You should offer it formally, in writing. Hector's been working on a handshake for 11 years. She paused. "He deserves a piece of paper that says what he means to this ranch." Rowan looked at her. "You've thought about all of this." "I think about things," she said. "That's understating it considerably." "I'm a modest person," she said. He looked at her with the expression, the one she'd stopped categorizing, and something in it was warm enough that she felt it in the chest. "We're getting married in June," he said. "I'm aware of that." "Mrs. Fenwick has offered the use of her garden." She turned to look at him. "When did that happen?" "Yesterday. She came to the gate and asked Hector to ask me if the offer would be welcome." He paused. "I thought it would be welcome." She thought about Mrs. Fenwick's kitchen and the cold chicken and the question, "What will you do?" and herself saying, "I'm deciding with $41 and nowhere to go." She thought about how that woman had looked at her, not with pity, but with the frank assessment of someone who had also figured out hard things and wanted to know if the person across from her was the kind who could. "Yes," she said, "it would be welcome." He nodded. She handed him back the coffee. They stood there a few more minutes. A hawk turned slow circles over the north pasture. The water ran over the stones in the particular sound that moving water makes, uneven, irregular, alive. And she thought about how long that water had been running wrong, and how it looked now, clean and direct in its channel, going exactly where it was supposed to go. There was something there that she would think about later, and probably for a long time after. About how long things can run in the wrong direction before someone pays enough attention to set them right. About how much careful, unglamorous, document-by-document work it takes to correct something that a careless person built wrong in the first place. About how the correction doesn't announce itself. There's no moment when the wrong suddenly becomes the right. It just gradually, persistently, incrementally does. She thought about that and about the woman on the platform with the valise and the $41, and about the distance between that woman and this one. Not a clean transformation, not a story of before and after, but a distance made of specific days and specific decisions, and one particular man who had looked at her without the quality of looking through and said, "What do you need to know?" before she'd even asked. The wedding was in June, which in Wyoming means the land is still surprised by its own greenness, still adjusting to warmth after so many months of cold, with a quality of almost excessive beauty that feels temporary and therefore more vivid than beauty that is permanent. Mrs. Fenwick's garden was not large, but it was well tended in the particular way of a garden that has been kept going for decades by someone who sees it as a small private argument against entropy. There were roses that were not quite at their peak yet, and columbine that was, and the mountains were visible over the fence in the northeast, and the whole thing was impractical and exactly right. The people who came were not many, but they were the right ones. Hector, in a clean shirt that Vivian suspected Delia had pressed for him, with his hat in his hands and the particular dignity of a man who knows the weight of the occasion. Tom Briggs, who had said nothing to Vivian in the weeks preceding, but had shown up that morning to help move chairs from the boarding house to the garden without being asked. Pete Danner, who cried briefly and wiped his face on his sleeve and looked around to see if anyone had noticed. And Jesse, who had noticed, and who was kind enough to also pretend he hadn't. Cal Whitmore, standing near the fence, communicating adequately with his boots. Doc Marsh, who had driven from town and brought a bottle of something decent from his personal stock. Alderman, who had made the journey from Cheyenne because he had told Rowan in his last letter that he had attended his share of cases and not enough of their resolutions, and he intended to remedy that. The young correspondent Albright, who had heard about it somehow, Pete's brother-in-law's network, probably, and had come not as a reporter but as himself, which was, Vivian thought, the right instinct and a sign that he might actually be good at his job eventually. And Delia, who stood at Vivian's left through the whole of it with her hands folded in front of her, and her face doing several things at once, none of which she would have described as emotion if asked, and all of which clearly were. The ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace from the next town over, a practical man who said practical words with a warmth that didn't require decoration. Rowan said what he said in his direct way, without embellishment, with the full attention he brought to everything that mattered. Vivian said what she said with the same quality, clear, considered, true, in the way that things are true when you have thought about them carefully and are not performing certainty, but actually feeling it. When it was finished, Delia produced a cake from somewhere. She had refused to explain the logistics of this, and Vivian had stopped asking. And Pete opened Alderman's bottle, and the afternoon moved into the particular kind of afternoon that happens when people who have been through something together sit in a garden in June and allow themselves to simply be where they are. At one point, sitting next to Mrs. Fenwick on the garden bench while Rowan talked to Alderman across the garden, Vivian became aware that Mrs. Fenwick was looking at her in the same assessing way she'd looked at her in the kitchen of the boarding house on the first night. "Well," Mrs. Fenwick said. Well, Vivian agreed. "When you sat in my kitchen and said you were deciding," Mrs. Fenwick said, "I thought you might be one of those women who says she's deciding and then goes back east." "I almost did," Vivian said. It was true, and she had not said it before to anyone. "The first night, I thought about the Thursday train. What stopped you?" She looked across the garden at Rowan, who was listening to Alderman with his full attention and nodding occasionally in the way he nodded when information was being genuinely useful. "A job offer," she said, "and the fact that 75 cents a night was a better rate than the hotel." Mrs. Fenwick made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. "I thought as much." And Vivian paused. "I think I was tired of making decisions from fear. I'd been doing that since my mother got sick. Every decision was about what I was running from or what I needed to secure." She looked at her hands. "Staying felt like the first decision I made because I wanted to see what happened next." She paused. "That was new." Mrs. Fenwick was quiet. Then, "Did you see what happened next?" Vivian looked around the garden, at the roses and the mountains and the people who were here and the afternoon light on all of it. "Yes," she said. "I saw." The years that came after were not uncomplicated, because years never are, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't lived enough of them. There were hard winters and a cattle disease in the third year that took 18 head and set the breeding program back by a season. There was a drought the year after that dried the north pasture to dust and required rerouting one of the water sources at significant cost. Jesse went to agricultural college and came back 2 years later with ideas that were good and an attitude that needed one season of Hector's patience to correct, which Hector applied without comment. Hector's son, whose name was Marco, turned out to be even better with cattle than his father, which Hector said nothing about but which you could see in him if you looked. There were arguments. Vivian and Rowan's arguments had a specific quality, which was that they were direct and sometimes loud and almost always over something factual, where one of them turned out to be right and the other had to acknowledge it. And the acknowledging was the hard part for both of them, because they were both people who thought carefully before speaking and did not like discovering they had been wrong. They got better at it over time. Not good. Better. Delia stayed for 4 more years and then retired to her sister's house in town, which was 3 miles away, which meant she appeared at the ranch approximately twice a week anyway. She said she was visiting. They said nothing about this and always set a place at the table. The ranch expanded, not dramatically, not in the way of ambition for its own sake, but in the way of a thing that is well managed and has good land and is run by people who understand the difference between growth that serves a purpose and growth that serves an idea of growth. They bought the adjacent eastern parcel when it came available in the 5th year, which extended the breeding program's range and removed the last vulnerable boundary from the Sutton property line. Gerald Sutton sold his ranch in the 6th year and left Wyoming. Nobody in Red Hollow spoke of it with particular drama. He had become by then exactly what Vivian had once thought he would become: a quiet embarrassment, something people mentioned only in the past tense and without investment. She did not think about him often. When she did, she thought about him the way you think about weather that was bad once, noting it, not reconstructing it. What she thought about more, and increasingly as the years accumulated, was the particular shape of the life that had been built in this place. Not the legal victories or the expanding acreage, or even the breeding program that by the 8th year was producing animals that buyers came from 3 territories to see. Those things mattered, but they were the visible surface of something else, and the something else was harder to name. She thought about it once, tried to put it into words, on an October evening when the children were asleep and Rowan was reading at the table and she was at the desk with the accounts, as she had been at the desk with the accounts on so many evenings in the years of their life together. She looked up from the ledger and looked at the room around her and tried to understand what she was feeling. It was not contentment exactly, or not only. Contentment implies a kind of fullness, a satiation, and what she felt was more active than that, more like engagement, the specific feeling of being in the right relationship with what you are doing and who you are doing it with and where you are doing it. The sense of fit. She had come to this place with $41 and a broken arrangement and a careful spine and the particular kind of competence that develops when you've never had the luxury of not being competent. She had come expecting a different life and had found this one instead, and the finding had not been clean. It had been hard and uncertain, and there had been moments when the only thing holding her forward was the habit of not stopping, the habit of doing the next thing. She had once thought of herself as someone passing through. She understood now that she had never been passing through. She had been arriving. The arriving just took longer than she'd planned and went through different country than she expected. That was, she thought, probably the truest thing about any life she had known. The destination is almost never the place you aimed for. It is the place you built toward without knowing you were building. One careful, documented day at a time, one decision made not from fear, but from the genuine desire to see what came next. She thought about what she would say to the woman on the platform, if she could. The woman with the valise and the $41, standing in front of 20 strangers with her spine very straight and the sound of Gerald Sutton's boot heels still audible on the platform boards. She would not tell her it would be all right. That kind of assurance she had never trusted, even when it turned out to be true, because it asked you to stop feeling what you were feeling, and she had never thought that was a useful request. She would say, "Keep going, not toward anything specific, just keep going, because what you're walking away from is not the same as what you're walking toward. And you won't be able to see the second thing clearly until you've gotten enough distance from the first. And you will get there not by being certain, but by being willing to stay uncertain and move anyway, which is harder, and also the only way it works." She would say, "The people who see you, really see you, not the image of you, not the version of you that is useful to them. Those people are rare, and they are the whole point. Everything else is accounts and fence lines and cattle and weather. The people who see you are the thing that makes the rest of it mean something." She looked across the room at Rowan, who was reading with his reading face, the focused, slightly furrowed quality that meant the book was actually engaging him, and thought that he had seen her first before she had anything to show him except how she stood after being knocked down, and that she had seen him too, at approximately the same moment, not the rancher on the platform being decent, but the man underneath the decent gesture, the one who said things 3 conversations behind because he was always making sure they were true before he said them. That mutual scene had been the beginning of everything that followed. Not attraction, though that came. Not practicality, though that mattered. Just 2 people actually looking at each other in a moment when looking was easier to avoid. The accounts could wait 5 more minutes. She closed the ledger and got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought his to the table and set it beside him and sat down across from him, not to say anything, just to be in the room together, in the particular way that married people are in rooms together after enough years. The companionable presence, the shared silence that is not emptiness, but its own kind of fullness. He looked up from the book. "Accounts done?" he asked. "No," she said. He looked at her. The reading face settled into the other one, the one that was just for her. "What is it?" "Nothing specific," she said. "I just wanted to sit here." He looked at her for a moment. Then he put the book down, which he never did when he was in the middle of it, and picked up his coffee. "All right," he said. Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what Wyoming nights do in October, producing a darkness and a cold and a star-filled sky of the kind that makes you understand why people once thought the sky was actually something, a ceiling on the world, a presence rather than an absence. The wind moved through the grass. Aldridge, older now, slower, still the center of the breeding program's logic, was in the barn, and the barn was warm and well kept and stood exactly where it had always stood, no longer threatened by anything except time, which is the only honest threat anything faces. Inside, the lamp burned on the table between 2 people who had chosen each other, not in the easy way of people who are just beginning and have not yet encountered the difficult parts, but in the harder and more durable way of people who have seen the difficult parts and kept choosing. That, Vivian had come to understand, was what love actually was when you stripped away what people said about it, not the feeling at the beginning, which was easy and unreliable. The choice in the middle, the continued choosing, the decision made again every day in small, unremarked ways, to stay, to see, to do the next thing alongside someone else instead of alone. She had thought she was coming west to begin a life. She had been right about that, as it turned out. She had just been wrong about which life and who it was with and what kind of woman she would have to become to live it fully. Those were, she thought, not the worst kinds of mistakes to make, the kind that turn out to have led somewhere true. Outside, the stars were indifferent and permanent and very far away, and the grass moved in the dark, and the ranch went on.